Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Hello Gamer Nation and welcome to the Dice Pool Podcast, covering everything that you've ever wanted to know about how to run and play in the GeneSys role-playing game by Fantasy Flood Games. I'm your host, GM Hooly, and this episode, and following on from last show, we're going to be talking about an encounter type that you are going to come across more often than not, which is combat. A topic we've not yet discussed on the show, surprisingly enough. But before we get into that, let me introduce you to a couple of guys that the only wall I'll be building in between them and me is the GM screen. GMs Huzz and Flano. How are we both this evening?
I'm doing good.
Yeah, breathing.
Breathing? Well, that's always a good sign. So what's everybody been up to? Huzz, you went and ran away
I did.
for CamCon. How was that?
It was good. I went down there with a bunch of buddies. We flew down. They were all playing Infinity. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but I went with them and didn't get to play.
Oh.
It was at the time I wasn't playing Infinity, nor was I really interested in the tournament. But I went down for the experience.
Right.
And it was really good. 3 days. Well, actually, how long was I there for?
4 days?
I don't even know anymore. I think it was 3 or 4 days. We were in Canberra, which is the capital of Australia.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't realise that. I barely know that. Because apparently it's a city and a state, although it's the size of like a small field.
Well,
It's a territory.
It's the Australian Capital Territory, of which Canberra is the capital of the ACT, but it's also the capital of our country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You literally walk from one side to the other in about 5 minutes and maybe see 3 people, one of which being one of our many ongoing roster of prime ministers that we have.
Right, yes.
Who is it now? I'm not sure.
Honestly,
Morrison, maybe?
I don't know.
I don't know.
For those who aren't aware of Australian politics, we change our prime minister more frequently than we change our underwear.
Yes.
No, but it's a good time to remember to change the batteries in your firearm.
That is true. It saves lives.
It does.
Every prime minister shift, it saves lives, and it changes the batteries in the smoke alarms. But no, CanCon, for those who don't know, it's one of Australia's largest tabletop gaming conventions, and it's run down in Canberra. It's spread across 3 very big halls at like a showground / exposition center down there.
Yep.
It's mostly mini gaming, like 90% of it.
Yeah.
There was an Warhammer Age of Sigmar tournament there with 250 players.
Cool.
A Warhammer 40k tournament with I think 200 players, so not much of a
Good.
difference. Infinity, which my mates were playing in, had I think was 60 players. Even then, they had 20 or so people on the waiting list. They just ran out of space to accommodate more players.
Jeez.
There was a Blood Bowl tournament. There was Flames of War. There was everything you think of. Actually, there was a lot of games going on there. There was an entire board game section in one of the halls.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and the board games were pretty cool. Not that I participated in any of them because it involves being social. You pay $15 or whatever it was, and they give you a lanyard, and you can play unlimited board games with whoever you wanted. And they had racks and racks and racks of board games. You basically organised your own game, sat down and played.
Yep.
But I spent the 3 days that I was there, not playing, just walking around, spending too much money. Lots to see in terms of things to buy and games being played, which is really good. But there was a lot of people there. Like, the place was packed, and it was on the first day 40 degrees Celsius.
Oh.
I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit because I'm not a sorcerer.
It's obscene is what it is.
But to be fair, it wasn't too bad because we're from Queensland. In Queensland, for those who aren't in Australia or nor have visited Queensland, it is like a tropical swamp all the time.
Yeah, but 40 degrees is where the government tells you can
Correct.
fob off work.
But 40 degrees down there was actually quite pleasant because it was dry heat. Now, I've never been from Queensland. I've never experienced a dry heat before. And I'm in the direct heat. I'm like, this is hot, but it's not that bad. It's kind of like staying next to an open oven. And I go, it's warm, but it's kind of crispy and toasty at the same time. It's lovely because I'm not also choking on swampy air. which you get in Queensland. You just feel
Thanks
gross.
to the humidity.
Exactly.
Yeah,
You feel gross all the time.
Yeah.
But it was weird. It was like every day CanCon was on, the temperature just dropped. Like first day was 40, next was 35, next was 20. By the last day it was pouring down rain. It was like 20 degrees.
That's good.
But yeah, apart from that, but the halls were, as you can imagine, with the body heat of all those people in tin sheds, very, very, very warm. In fact, the 40K tournament, some players lost all their clothes bar boxes.
Oh, really?
Because that's 40K players.
Wow.
Because you know what they call, you know how like there's for a group of crows, it's called like a murder.
Murder, yeah.
Do you know what they call a group of gamers?
What's that?
A stink.
Yeah, I could see that. But it wasn't that bad.
That's official. That's from like Gen Con.
Oh, wow. It's Gen Con legit.
Yeah.
There you go. No, actually, it wasn't too bad. Like the hall that Infinity was being played in, it had air conditioning.
Right.
Not really.
No, not with that many bodies.
The heat being put out was far more than the poor air conditioning unit could ever handle from the combined heat of outside and all those sweaty gamers under the roof. But the actual stay in Canberra was great. We had a hotel,
Yep.
which we retreated to at the end of the day and had a hire cars, so we didn't have to worry about Ubering anywhere. So it was a good little holiday away. I didn't actually do any gaming, but I just watched a lot of gaming, and it has since reinvigorated my passion in Infinity, and I've dived deep into it. And as you do. And this year I'm focusing on Infinity, Star Wars Legion, Aristea, which is technically Infinity as well, and that's going to be my 3 tabletop games, and everything else can go away. Not including RPGs, because RPGs is life, and I don't count that as a hobby. So... Yes.
And they didn't have much in the way of RPGs, did they?
Not that I saw. Apparently someone told me there was an RPG room somewhere, but if it was somewhere, it was in the deepest, dankest corner that I couldn't find without a map.
A single meeting room somewhere.
Some must have been somewhere. There was some little spaces in this area that I didn't go to, but they weren't super obvious. So if there was an RPG hall somewhere, I missed it. So regrets there potentially. But
because there is a role-playing convention on at exactly the same time in Melbourne.
Yes.
Which is called Arcana.
Yes, I was invited to that by another friend. And I checked the dates and,
Yeah.
that's a shame, because we were in a real clash, because I sort of wanted to go to both, but I think ultimately, depending on what was being played at the RPG con, I probably would have gone to the RPG con. But that's fine.
Yeah. Look, I've been to ArcanaCon, and look, it's okay. It's done in a school. Or a college or something like that, I think. But, good con. Don't sort of expect it to be all sort of ritzy dits or whatever. Is that a word?
No, it's not.
Okay.
But we'll let it slide. But I think that's fair to say for any Australian con, because our player base is so small, it's hard to get to the big lofty heights that other cons may have, where they can afford all the fancy halls and stuff like that.
True.
When you have like maybe 10 players in the whole of Australia playing one game, it can get fairly difficult to organise a big convention hall with nice overheads.
Indeed. Martin, what have you been up to?
Well, we went to go see this show called The Empire Strips Back.
You did.
Yeah.
I was going to go, but I piked out.
You did, you big piker.
I'm sorry.
But no, it was really, really good. The show is absolutely amazing. They just actually did a stint in the States.
Take the family, take the kids.
Well, it is burlesque, so maybe not.
Maybe not the kids. Maybe no.
Oh, if you want to get technical about it, or prudish.
But it is an absolutely superb show.
Was good.
The venue could have done with a bit of upgrading. And,
Well, the venue itself, the venues are live, mostly for live gigs. So standing around, it's fantastic. But this was seated, and
it wasn't ideal, but
on a flat floor.
Yeah.
So if short people, I was struggling to see, and I'm 6 foot something tall. So anyone who's shorter than that, I don't know how they saw the stage. Like Lily was struggling. I had to swap seats with your friend Lily.
Yeah.
Because she just couldn't see the stage.
Poor Maddie was sitting behind me. I don't know how she managed, but...
Poor Maddie and the guy she was sitting next to that night.
Oh, that guy.
He was very loud, very ochre Australian, that dude.
Right.
Yeah. He was...
I can't imagine that Maddie would be too impressed. And that's Madeline, who was with us for both of our live plays.
That's correct.
But I think everyone had a good time, and that's pretty much the highlight. I am going to see Ailstorm live soon.
What is Ailstorm?
Pirate metal.
Really?
Yeah,
That sounds
they're
awesome.
a band. They're awesome. If you look up their stuff, it's great.
Right.
Should get into that mosh pit. That'll be something special. You'll walk out with an eye patch there, buddy.
Possibly, if I ever walk out. Yeah, but no, it's going to be good. I think that's actually tomorrow.
You should really check that.
That's probably an idea. Yeah.
This is basically
It's soon.
for those listening at home, that's basically how Martin runs his social events. I think I have something tomorrow.
Yeah.
All good. As far as what I've been up to, I look, work, life, no balance. Lots of gaming for me, which is cool. Most of which you guys have been part of.
Yeah.
So I've run since our last episode. I've run some. Did I run Star Wars? No, I didn't run Star Wars. We didn't have it because Mike was away and Sean was away. So I've played. I've run some L5R, which we finished off current generation.
2 sessions later.
2 sessions later.
That was a 2 session 0, which is needed sometimes.
Yeah, that's true. And we got to play our first game of Star Trek Adventures last night, which was really, really cool. 8 players. What was I thinking?
8 players plus brand new system. That's probably the biggest bane.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It's the first time I've looked at the 2D20 system, and it's pretty good.
I like it. I like it a lot.
Yeah, I played a fair bit with the Infinity RPG system, and so I sort of knew what I was getting in for. And it's interesting because the 2D20 system is fundamentally a very straightforward system.
Yep.
And Star Trek uses it in a very lightweight way, whilst Infinity uses it in a very heavy, crunchy way.
Right.
So it's a good testament to the system and the fact you can plug it into 2 very different universes and have 2 different weight classes of rules attached to it, and both work very, very well. It's very. If you want to do the comparison, I highly recommend it. If you're into that sort of rules crunch comparison business, 'cause it's interesting.
And John Connor from Mars or whatever it's
John Carter, that's still in Kickstarter, I believe. So I looked at that last night.
Yep.
Yeah, John Carter. What else do they do in the 2D20? Conan, which I think was the second game that came out of the 2D20. I might be wrong, or third game. But the very first one was Mutant Chronicles.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
I'd be very interested in John Carter, though. That's a setting that I read a lot of the books for when I was younger. Yeah.
I think if you're into that sort of space 1899 type sort of feel, I think that'd be perfect.
Yes.
But anyway, yes, one thing that we should mention is we're minus Caitlin tonight.
I didn't notice.
She's being very quiet today.
She's very quiet. Yes, unfortunately, Caitlin has been called away to work, so we have boo. I know.
Responsibilities and being an adult. What happens when you get married? You just suddenly grow up.
Oh, no. That's why I'm divorced.
Just married life gets in the way of gaming, doesn't it?
It pretty much does. But anyway. So let's talk podcast of the week.
This week's podcast is D20 Radio's Powered by Fate podcast. If you have played, are playing, or want to play the Fate role-playing game, then this show is for you. Hosted by JT, Ben, and Rob. They are the new kids on the block on the D20 Radio Network, and their first show launched to a great success. They discuss some fantastic topics on the show, covering all of your Fate needs. In fact, their next episode, which will be launching soon, will be all about aspects, what they are, what they do, what do they represent, and hopefully how to write a good one. You can listen to the podcast and many more by visiting d20radio.com.
Indeed.
Now, Fate's a system that I've had sitting on my shelf forever.
Yep.
I see you have a copy of it sitting on your shelf
Correct.
as well.
Yep.
I've always wanted to play it, so I might give their podcast a listen.
I listened to the first episode, and yeah, it's they probably could have started with how to play, but they felt that look, it's go by the book if you want to know.
Well, I think they're probably thinking if you're listening to a Fate podcast, you probably have a
basic understanding.
of it,
exactly,
because it is one of those very niche systems. It does look quite interesting, and there's so many Fate like conversions and etc.
There are. There's so you just go through a drive-through RPG, and there is countless different sort of settings. So it's kind of similar to GeneSys in that regard, but they have an OGL.
Well, I know there's a Fate Eclipse phase official book that I really want to get because
really?
I love Eclipse Phase's lore and setting, but the
crunch.
the magnitude of the crunch to run or even play in that game is quite overwhelming. So to find a fate system for it where you can explore that cool narrative with relatively ease, then I think it'd be pretty interesting.
Well, one of the source books I think they had was Tachyon Squadron, which is basically a Dragon Squadron supplement. So you can run like an X-Wing squadron if you want to go down that path, or some sort of fighter squadron like a Top Gun or whatever else, and it looks really cool.
That'd be cool.
But I got it when somebody had for sale I think it was a superheroes game. I can't remember exactly what it's called now.
There's about 2 million of them, yeah.
Yeah, but that was set during Fate, so it looks pretty cool. So, yeah, I've not played Fate myself.
You know what we should do?
We should play some Fate.
Oh, no, we should get JT to run a Fate game live for us and we record it. So if you're listening, JT,
yeah, dude,
There's an idea.
we're available.
you know,
We
a crossover episode.
That's what I like.
Everyone loves a crossover because it establishes the universes that exist into one area.
They do.
Like Cheers and Frasier.
Really?
Yes, really.
are they-
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
They're in
There
the
you
same
go.
world.
Yeah. And was it Wings is pseudo in the same world too. It's produced by the same people, I believe, and references characters from Cheers in Wings.
Right. Cheers. The role-playing game coming to you soon. All right, so should we get into core of the show?
Let's do it.
Core of the show. And welcome to Core of the Show, the segment where we take a deep dive into a topic concerning the GeneSys role-playing game and, of course, gaming in general. Now, one thing that is used most often in a GeneSys role-playing game, or pretty much any role-playing game for that matter, is combat. Now, that's not social combat. That's not what we will be talking about today. That's another topic entirely. What we're going to talk about is balls to the walls, gun-toting, martial arts, wielding combat. So if you want to shoot something, throw something, punch something, or generally get yourself into a scuffle, then this is the topic for you. So what we're going to do tonight is go through the combat rules with a fine-tooth comb. We're not going to be reading it directly from the book. You guys can all read out there, so we don't need to go through that.
We hope you can read.
If you can't, I don't know whether this is available in an audiobook. It probably should.
I don't know how you're that'd be a very hard descriptor.
How would you do tables? Anyway, that's a side topic. So tonight, we're going to basically tackle the basics.
Let's tackle it.
Tackle it. Good idea. So yes, tackle the basics and then add our own experiences with tips and tricks about how to make your combats that much more interesting during your game sessions. So let's get a high-level approach to combat. What is it in the GeneSys role-playing game, and what are we needing to know? Huzz!
All right. So as a basic overview, because we're going to go into detail on the elements of combat very shortly, so hopefully you can wait around long enough. Combat in GeneSys is narrative and free-flowing. It's designed to be semi-rigid but flexible enough to inject your own narrative, whatever's to it.
Yeah.
Unlike other game systems, where yes, you can get narrative in other game systems in their combats, GeneSys is hard-baked with it into the core elements of it.
Yeah.
So it encourages players to think out of the box and get, a very action movie with their combats.
Yeah.
And once the players at the table grasp that concept and understand it, you suddenly have some really, really cool combats going on.
Yeah.
And I think everyone here sitting at this podcast has experienced that in our games.
Very much so.
Yeah, so as I say, it encourages that creativity. Although it is narrative at its core, combat is considered structured, and with everything falling into more or less two categories: maneuvers and actions. Do you have incidentals as well, which is sort of like a mini maneuver? Maneuvers and actions are the two things your characters are going to be doing in every single combat.
Yep.
Primarily.
That's it. Each of those carry their own unique mechanics, which we will cover in verbatim as we go along.
Yep.
But generally speaking, everything you want to do in combat, you can usually do it as either maneuver or an action. And how you describe those maneuvers and actions is what paints that narrative flair. Because everyone can say they're moving to one side of the room to the other, but if you say you're diving to the other side of the room while shooting your dual pistols, it sounds way cooler.
It does, indeed.
Yep.
So for those following on at home, combat encounters are covered from page 95 of the GeneSys core rulebook. And it goes on for literally pages about how to deal with combat. In actual fact, it goes all the way up. If I'm looking at it, it goes all the way up to page 117. So there's a lot of information in there, but it is just a framework. So you can adjust things as you go. So we'll be basically just talking about just the frameworks of the standard system if you were just playing it straight out of the book for your setting.
And no doubt we'll probably inject our own tricks and tips that we sort of have
learned along the way
from playing Star Wars. And it won't necessarily be raw, but then again, some of the best elements of a game isn't necessarily raw anyway. So
that is true. All right, so let's talk about actions, incidentals, and maneuvers, because as you said, that's kind of the thing that is sitting at the core of what the combat system is. So combat allows you to have an action and it allows you to have a maneuver. You can replace that action for a maneuver as well, or if you want to do the two maneuvers and the action, it will cost you 2 strain for the additional maneuver. You can do as many incidentals as the GM feels is possible in the round. And those sort of incidentals are basically things like talking, dropping items. What else? What sort of other things are incidentals?
Well, I like to think of incidentals as anything that you can do without really raising an arm. It's stuff like
flicking that cigarette that you were smoking at the beginning of the combat and then doing something else.
Yeah.
Like
dropping that weapon on the ground that's run out of ammo or something
mostly
like that.
narrative
Yeah.
until we start getting into talents and things
Correct.
that downgrade other actions.
Yeah.
Being able to turn a maneuver into an incidental
Very powerful.
through talents is fantastic. And I think the biggest thing that comes to everyone's mind there is quick draw.
Quick draw. Yep.
Every gunslinger character in any RPG you're playing will almost always take quick draw.
Yeah.
Because be able to pull your pistol out as incidental is massive. It's a great talent to have.
Absolutely. So you've basically, so that covers pretty much incidentals. As I said, you can do as many of those as the GM will allow you to in the round.
Within reason.
Within reason.
What's appropriate?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Usually you're not going to be, if you're having to like ask your GM, can I do this many incidentals? I can't figure out what you're doing.
The answer should be no.
Are you dropping everything you own? I don't get it. So usually the biggest limiting factor to incidentals is generally your imagination, because there's not many things you can do with them other than very few simple things.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard of some GMs that will allow 1 incidental, 1 maneuver, and 1 action, and then the additional maneuver for the 2 strain, because that's just doing far too much within that short period of time. Now, admittedly, there is no sort of, it's not like D&D where it's 6 seconds is around.
Yeah, I disagree with only allowing 1 incidental though. And the reason is for things like improved quick draw.
Yep.
You can draw 2 pistols, but each one costs you an incidental.
Yeah.
So, not just pistols, any item. And like if you want to talk whilst flicking away that cigarette butt, why can't you? That's 2 incidentals.
That's right.
Like it's what's appropriate.
Yeah, and I agree.
It's that fine line of keeping in mind that the narratives, it's probably worth mentioning because combat is a very structured time encounter in GeneSys. And it goes to great lengths in explaining to the reader of the book that structured encounters don't have a fixed time.
Yeah.
Although, yes, they're structured, they go at the speed of plot.
Yes.
Yep.
So it's that D&D / almost every other initiative-based structured role-playing game, everyone's used to having that very rigid time set where everything happens within that 6-second window.
Yeah.
In GeneSys, that's not necessarily the case.
Yep.
A turn could take anywhere between a second to a minute or whatever. It's supposed to be fairly loosey-goosey, so players can... It allows a lot more room for narrative if you take away that time.
Yeah.
Because it's hard to get narrative if you restrict it to 6 seconds of time to do something.
Yep. It's kind of like if they take a shot with a blaster or something like that, or a gun or whatever. That wipes out, you were shooting at a minion group or something like that, and suddenly you've wiped out 3 minions. It may be the case that one bullet has gone through 3 people, aka Deadpool. Or it might be a case that, it's done over several sort of frames of a story.
And we'll probably discuss this further later on, but I know we're talking on a tangent right now, but since we're here, we might as well talk about it.
Yep.
When you do an action in combat, i.e. shooting, that example against the minion group, because if you're using a pistol and that's got a short range, right, and you're firing a minion group who is in short range, when you're firing that pistol, you're not necessarily staying there static. You can narratively describe yourself as moving around within that short range bubble, hunting down the minions and bringing them down one at a time, very John Wick style.
Yeah.
Yes, your position doesn't change mechanically, but narratively, you're still within that short range area. And so you can jump from bookshelf to bookshelf, blasting guys or taking cover behind them. And with one pistol, with one range attack roll, you've slain a whole minion group. And narratively, that allows you to describe yourself doing something. Because if you're just stuck behind a wall taking shots without moving, it's very boring, not very narrative. But if you take away that shackle and your movement's purely narrative, it suddenly becomes so much more awesome.
They may call this structured combat, but it's only sort of like half structured.
The framework's structured, but there's a lot of wiggle room inside that framework.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's talk maneuvers. So there's a large number of things that you do with maneuvers. You can aim weapons. You can move from one point to another. You can open a door. Doing something that doesn't really take a lot of sort of effort, but does require more than an incidental.
Yeah.
I know a lot of newer players sort of get what a maneuver and a action is mixed up.
Yeah.
It's easy to imply, or even easy to think that a maneuver is just moving. Not necessarily. Well, it is and it isn't. Like
the way that I think about maneuvers is that it is a task that you can do without really focusing on it.
Exactly. You don't have to think about it. That's exactly what I was going to say. Anything you do without having to stop and think.
Yep.
A good example is climbing a rocky cliff face.
Yep.
Yes, you're moving, but that should not be a maneuver. Because if you're climbing that rocky cliff face without any safety gear or anything like that, and it's treacherous, and you have to think about what you're doing, actively focus your task on climbing that wall, that should be an action.
Yep.
If it's a ladder on that cliff face, then it shouldn't be. That should be a maneuver because everyone can climb a ladder without thinking about it.
Yeah.
Yes, you may have your hands tied up, so you can't use some big guns or something like that as you're climbing that ladder. But ultimately, the maneuver of climbing that ladder, you don't have to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anything that you have to give some sort of effort to is obviously going to be an action.
Yep.
And that sort of, dovetails nicely into what actually an action is. Now, an action can be, as it says in the book, it can be hacking a computer, unlocking a locked door, firing a weapon, punching or grappling an opponent, etc., etc. So it is definitely something that is going to require that little bit more effort to do, that you're going to have to be more focused on.
Yeah.
So yeah.
An action doesn't always even have to involve a check.
No.
Like if you want to speed up play, I'll use that rock face as an example again.
Yep.
There could be enough footholds and whatnot on that rock face for it to be a relatively straightforward climb. You may, if you want to speed up the play, you can just say to your player, "Hey, don't worry about making a check. You can do it. It's just going to cost you your action." And alone costing the action can be punishment enough.
It can be pretty,
because they're suddenly not attacking. They're not participating in the fight directly. Your sniper who has to climb down a rock face or climb up a rock face to shoot isn't going to be able to spring up that rock face and take a shot afterwards. He has to burn his action. That's him done for a turn. So that's one way of doing it. Check without actually even rolling a dice. You just pay the action tax.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was just about to say. So that is the nuts and bolts of what you can do in combat. And obviously that list is fairly
loosey-goosey.
It's fairly non-exhaustive is what I'm saying. So there's all sorts of things. So how do we actually run combat? So to answer that question, we need to obviously take a look at the various steps that have to occur during combat. Now there are basically 5 steps to combat. And they are step 1, where you determine initiative. Step 2, where you assign initiative slots. Then step 3, the participants, so everybody who is taking part in the combat, take turns. And then the round ends, and if people are still alive, you basically repeat steps 3 and 4. Once all of the enemies or the PCs have been eliminated, and then the encounter ends, or it may be a case that there's a truce, or it could be one side surrenders, or for whatever reason, that the encounter ends. So let's start with step 1, which is determining the initiative. So the story with initiative is that you make a simple check of either a cool or vigilance. We'll get on to the difference between those two in a minute, because that sort of is something that a lot of people ask about. The GM rolls for the NPCs, the players roll for the PCs. And the number of successes works out where you sit in the list of
the initiative
order. And then advantages are basically used to act as tiebreakers. However, when the PCs and NPCs have the same number of advantages when working out the tiebreaker, the PCs will always win over the NPCs. So basically what happens is that you generate, as your position generates PC or player character, and then the GM, they generate a non-player character slot. So you then, rather than having as per other game systems such as Dungeons and Dragons and things like that, where you have a very specific spot in the initiative order, it's then opens very loosey-goosey again, to use that term, as to where you sit or where you can act during that round. So effectively, if you've come to the end of the combat round and you're the last person to act, technically speaking, if there is a PC slot at the top, you can act again.
In the following round.
So
which can be very useful when it comes to timing talents and stuff like that. You can get very tactical with that initiative slot ordering. That's one of the beauties about GeneSys is that flexibility, because you can go at opportune moments that suit your character in the situation at hand.
Yep.
If you're someone who gives out a universal buff at the start of a turn, generally you want to take the most first PC slot and then give that out to everyone so the future PCs can benefit from that.
Yep.
But in the following round of combat, it could be vital for your sniper to go first. Then he can take that first slot next round, or whenever it may suit before a particular NPC goes or something like that. It's a great system, but there's lots of tips and tricks to it, though, which I think we could probably go into.
Absolutely. So one of the things, because you're obviously not necessarily at this point, generating threat or anything like that, so you're only using the advantages. We'll get into that. We'll get into that. So if you've got, as we said, the advantages are used only to act as tiebreakers. However, this question has been asked on the FFG forums, not under the GeneSys section, but under Star Wars. And Sam Stewart has said, after being asked the question, that they can't actually be used for anything else. However, as an optional rule, and I know that I do it, and it works totally fine, is that the player, instead of using them to act as
boring old tiebreakers,
that they can use it to inject some type of narrative into the scene, or give themselves a bonus, or notice something, or something like that. Triumphs can certainly be used, as it says in the rulebook. Triumphs can be used to give the character a bonus maneuver.
Yep.
But there is nothing to say, actually the rules say, and Sam says, but I know that it works for me as well, that you can use your triumph to upgrade a check, add something, again, narrative to the scene that's going to benefit the encounter.
Adding a piece of cover that wasn't there before. You could use that triumph in magnitude of ways.
Yep.
You could add a really cool piece of narrative scenery to the ongoing fight. Suddenly your team has the high ground that wasn't, narratively described when you're suddenly attacked by these ninjas. but your team happens to hold this small little hill. Small little thing can change how the landscape of the ongoing combat.
You'd win the combat, though, if you had the high ground.
Or only if you're Anakin. Not everyone. If you're versing Anakin on a lava planet.
True.
Yeah. But remember that if you spend your advantages in this way, they're no longer contributing towards your initiative.
Correct.
Now, it's probably worth, if we're discussing this, because it is one of those topics where can you or can't you officially do it. If we're saying you can do it, your GM has said, yep, you can use your advantages during initiative rolls. Because obviously the NPCs can roll advantages too in the situation.
Correct.
So who resolves advantages first? I would rule the PCs resolve all their advantages.
Yep.
Followed by the NPCs.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is, remember, this is an optional rule.
Yeah,
this is something you need to clear with your GM first.
Yep.
Preferably before you get into combat where it's going to cause book diving and arguments and things.
So,
do it before you sit down at the table.
Right. So officially, there is nothing in the errata and there is nothing in the rulebook that says that you can or you can't do it.
It's very grey.
It's very grey. Sam has in the FFG forums under Star Wars, not GeneSys. For those who, want to go down the whole rules lawyering side of things, I guess, that there is nothing in GeneSys that says that they can or they can't. But we're suggesting as a house rule that you and your GM can consider is that you allow this to occur to just add a little bit more flavour to your scenes.
Yep. Absolutely. Now, also, you mentioned that initiative checks are simple.
Yes.
It's worth mentioning that's not always the case.
No, that is
just like any check in the game. A simple check is a check.
Yep.
Checks can still be increased or upgraded or have boosts or setback added to them.
Yep.
So there's no reason why initiative check is always going to be simple. If the players didn't see the assassins coming, that check may have some setback dice, even difficulty dice.
Or even opposed.
Even opposed.
But remember, environmental effects such as fog or, high heat or something like that could affect this check and add setback as normal to it.
Exactly right.
By making it opposed as well, the added benefit there is you're rolling initiative into the one roll. So you're skipping a whole chunk of extra time. Especially when players know when a combat starts, players know there's going to be bad guys. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah.
And if you make them make that initiative check in the first round of combat on their initiative, it's kind of irrelevant and a waste of a bit of time.
Yep.
But if they're being snuck up upon by some ninjas or some other equally stealthy thing, that opposed to the creature's stealth, their initiative opposed to the creature's stealth, vigilance probably in this case.
Vigilance versus stealth. Very perfect.
Works perfectly.
Yeah, absolutely.
If they fail that check horribly, that NPC is going first, or NPCs are going first above the players,
Yep.
and it represents that ambush perfectly. And you don't have to ham-fist anything.
And
it
there's
just
only
works.
one check.
Exactly. I know we did a Star Wars game not too long ago, and you guys were attacked by really stealthy droids in a forest, and I made an opposed check. And when I declared initiative, everyone's like, yeah, well, we've got this. Then I said, you're going to be opposing 2 red and 1 purple.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, what? And I think everyone bar one player failed the checks and generated threats and despairs and all that other juicy stuff the GM loves to see. And it shaped the combat massively. The threats put the players into bad positioning and the attacking droids into better positioning and added some boosts and advantages and setbacks, etc.
Yep.
And the first round of combat was a brutal ambush like a brutal ambush should be.
Keeping in mind that this works best if you use our optional rule from before.
Correct.
Yeah.
Where you can spend advantages and threats at the roll of initiative.
That's right.
Would I recommend this for a beginner group? Probably not.
No.
An advanced group who's quite seasoned, go nuts. It paints a wonderful image of the upcoming combat straight away.
Because I know that there's always a number of questions that come up because the things on Pathfinder and D&D do it, where you have the surprise round, where if you get the jump on the NPCs or the NPCs get the jump on you, that they get I think it's an action to do before combat begins, and then you go into the correct initiative round.
Yep.
Where this kind of doesn't have that, kind of like it also doesn't have readied actions and things like that. So doing it this way is a really cool way of allowing that to happen.
It creates a natural surprise round.
Yeah.
Not a artificial feeling one that other more rigid systems kind of make.
Yeah.
It's like if one player happens to roll high and succeed on that check and gets an initiative slot before an NPC, that PC slot is super valuable.
Yeah.
Because you have 10 NPCs with one PC slot sitting somewhere in the top range.
Yep.
That slot is prized real estate for the PCs.
Absolutely.
The PC who has rolled that super high check, you could represent that narrative by him screaming out a warning.
Yeah.
And the sniper in the group goes, well, I'm going to take this opportunity and spin around.
Yeah.
Exactly. And blasts one or more of these droids as they make the ambush.
Yeah.
Yep. Now, speaking of, cool things, we should probably mention what the other ability is that we can use.
So we've basically, you're talking cool and vigilance.
Cool and vigilance.
So this is something that, they do talk about it in the game, but I think it requires probably a little bit more guidance. There's an entire sidebar on it on the first page just to indicate how important it is.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of players and GMs sort of getting mixed up on what the difference between cool and vigilance is.
Yeah.
The difference, as we're about to discuss, is that cool is when you've got the jump, when you're prepared and you're sitting there and it's trying to keep your jitters down, keep you focused on the task at hand while you wait for that perfect moment.
You're about to take the fight to the enemy.
Yeah.
I.e. storming a trench or some such like that. Or an ambush.
Yep. Whereas where combat just spontaneously happens, that's vigilance.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is where I think a few people, as Mike said, that they get a little bit muddled up as to which one to use. Now, one thing that I find that, might be an interesting little discussion sort of as a side note here is when the PCs basically have the jump on the NPCs. And so by the rules, you'd be using cool. And then you have some PCs who say, well, I haven't actually spent any ranks in cool, but I've spent ranks in vigilance.
Well, that's a shame.
So the question is, and I know that I've been asked during sessions, is, well, which one do I use? Now, to speed up combat, a lot of the time I will just say, whichever one you want to use. You guys have got the jump in combat. And that sort of removes any arguments. It errs on the side of caution with the PCs so that they feel like that they're not being disadvantaged just because they've decided to focus on one and not the other.
Yes or no, but you have to be careful because it's very easy to say take that option when a player has a low cool.
Yeah.
But usually when it's the other way around, it doesn't make sense to allow it to happen, if that makes sense. Because if a player has a low vigilance and it's a cool check, it could be, you could hand wave and say you can use your vigilance. But if a player's ever making a vigilance check, cool almost never makes sense.
Yeah.
So that could be unfair to the players who have spent XP in vigilance and the players with the high cool have no detriment.
Yep. That's right.
So you have to be careful what you do over there. Like some cases you can get away with it just perfectly fine. It makes sense that you could use both. But be wary that it may also throw the balance out a little bit one way or the other.
So it is definitely a case-by-case basis on what to look at. For people who've never played the game before, I would recommend staying with the rules as they are. So if they're aware of the combat's going to happen, it's cool. Everybody has to roll cool. And the same with if they
didn't
know combat was going to happen.
Or it happens suddenly.
It's vigilance.
So
simple as that.
Expected combat, cool. Unexpected combat, vigilance.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's the easiest way around.
Yeah, basically over there. Now, one thing I will also ask.
Yeah.
If I'm making an initiative check, does it always have to be cool and vigilance?
Good question. The rules say yes.
But we like to break rules around here.
We do indeed.
Like I wouldn't be necessarily inclined to say it's always those two options. I could see perception being a form of initiative check.
I can see survival.
Yep. Even computers,
If you're talking hacking or something like that, absolutely.
It's going to be very dependent on the scenario. Like, for example, if the players are setting up Shadow of the Beanstalk, because here, if you're lucky enough to already have it,
We're not.
If the PCs are about to launch a raid on a corporation HQ,
Yep.
one player is the runner, and he set himself up in a situation where he's off location but is wired in. The runner could say, "Hey, can I use my computer's check to see how well I get the jump in this ongoing combat?" Because he's poising himself in his field that he knows best, his virtual space. So he's using his computer skill to set himself up in a great location to get that launching point.
Now, something else that can be used as well is obviously a skill like tactics, if you wanted to go down that path, or knowledge warfare, which is out of the Age of Rebellion role-playing game.
Well, my Star Wars character in our current game uses warfare for initiative via talent.
Via talent.
Yeah. So I think the thing to take into consideration there is that there are talents that allow those sorts of things to happen. So you've got to be very, very careful about, it might be a tier 3 talent, for example. I don't know whether it is, but it could be something like that. That player is invested 15 plus whatever XP it's up the ranks to invest in that particular talent that allows them to use one of their skills that would not normally be used for normally used for initiative, but in this case is.
The difference there is, though, those talents can always be used, no matter what, without having to beg the GM.
Sure.
But I mean,
Story points.
This is a game as well that it is what we make it. Why not add that talent?
Yeah.
Yeah, true.
But like
Just make it.
if a player wants to use another skill for initiative, if he proposes a good enough case to the GM, and that makes sense, the GM can say sure, or sure, but flip a story point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's what the story points are there for.
And I mean, they're certainly not as much available in GeneSys as they are in Star Wars either.
talents.
So yeah, no, I'm talking story points.
Story points.
Because
Yeah,
Destiny
absolutely.
points in Star Wars, there's a lot more Destiny points I've found.
There are.
Where GeneSys, it's only one per player.
Yep.
The economy's a lot tighter.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like that.
So do I.
Yeah.
Well, every time I've run a Star Wars game recently, I've always used Genesis system.
Yep.
It just saves time. More than anything else, I don't have to worry about rolls. Just bam, there it is.
Yeah.
And every single session starts with that exact fixed number of white and black pips.
I think the reason in Star Wars Defense, I guess the reason why that is because force powers
Use it a bit more.
use it a lot
Absolutely, yeah,
more. And I
for
mean,
sure.
obviously, if you don't have force users in your party,
Yep.
maybe that might be an option to use Genesis instead.
I do also find that with the smaller amount of story points, it sort of forces that back and forth.
It swings a lot.
You've got to keep on top of that, or it doesn't work so well.
Yeah.
Whereas when you've got 60 bazillion Destiny points in the pool, you can forget about them.
Yeah, true.
Because once it swings one way, it's very hard to bring it back.
Yeah.
Very, very true. Very true. So that's talking. So we've talked actions, incidental maneuvers. We've talked initiative.
And story points to a degree.
And story
by
points to a
accident.
degree.
Accidental story pointing. But that's a big part of combat still, story points.
Look, that's a big part of the game generally.
It's a great point.
Yeah. Dear. So you can go back and listen to our episode Story Pointers, where we talk about how to use story points during your games. So let's talk about a topic which I know is near and dear to our hearts because we've discussed it so many times, and obviously this is a podcast. You can't see my two associates shaking their heads because this does cause problems more so with vehicles. That is going to be an entire topic. We are not talking movement with vehicles. Just
We'll come back to that.
We will.
We won't poison the water yet because I'm sure a lot of people are living in this serene comfort knowing there's actually thinking there's no problem with the vehicle movement rules. And I'm sure someone is listening to me right now saying, what is GM Huzz talking about? Keep living in your safe bubble. Don't deep dive.
Look, it only becomes a problem when you look at it like with a fine-tooth
Like we
comb,
do.
we did, and we got ourselves in a knot.
Yes.
But it's great. Just don't worry about it. Just use them as they are. You'll love it.
Use them as you think they are.
Yes. But
So yeah. But no, we'll be definitely doing a topic in relation to that at a later stage.
I'm going to be sick that episode.
We'll
Might
get
just
there.
be Martin and I.
But for now, we're talking movement.
That's right.
So basic
personal
movement.
scale movement.
Yeah, which is something tried and tested.
Yeah.
Basically put, the way that GeneSys does it and Star Wars before it is that it breaks it down into range bands. This is the most important aspect of movement because it is very freeform and narrative. So the range bands that are available to you are short, medium, long, and extreme.
Correct.
And there's another one, which it's better if you don't think of it purely as a range band, but more of a status condition that can be applied, which is engaged.
Correct. Yep.
So it's a bit of a range band as well as a status.
That's right.
It's a It depends on what angle you hold in the rule book when you read the rule.
But it works. It works like that, which is good.
Yes.
When you think of it that way. Now, to move between a range band, generally, well, to move from short to medium, it costs you a maneuver.
Correct.
To move from medium to long, it costs you 2 maneuvers.
2 maneuvers. That's right.
And the same to go from long to extreme.
Yes.
To engage with a player, it'll cost you 1 maneuver.
Yeah.
So you apply that engage condition to both yourself and the opponent.
target. That's right.
So getting engaged with, I said it comes up a fair bit. People assume once you get within short range, you automatically engage with someone to hit them with your sword. Not the case. So if you're at medium range, you have to spend 2 maneuvers to go to short and then to engage.
The reasoning for that is because your opponent's hostile.
Yeah. That's right.
So you've got to close with them in order to get to a distance where you can reach them without taking any sort of
Attack of opportunity. Without using Pathfinder
because
or
there are no attacks of opportunity. It's simply put, it costs you a little bit more to cautiously approach your opponent.
Yeah.
And it also is a good representation that a short range bubble or zone is a space that you still have to move around within.
Yeah.
So to get within, engage with someone, you have to actively move whilst within that short range bubble.
This is the other thing. When you're in short range, if you want to move from one point within short range to another point within short range, say to move from cover to cover, it costs you a maneuver.
Yep.
So it's the same thing. If you want to move from where you are just out in the open into close with an opponent, it costs you a maneuver.
Yep.
That's right.
So just that maneuver to go from medium to short is just putting you in the vicinity of where you want to be.
Absolutely. Now, the only thing to take into consideration with that is that it does cost you a maneuver to move into cover.
It does,
Actually,
yeah.
specifically says that.
But
So,
but if you're thinking about it as I'm moving from some within short range,
Yep.
it applies to all of that.
Yeah. So if you're moving from a console to a vehicle,
It costs you a maneuver.
that's right.
You're gaining some benefit out of it, whether it's narrative or actual mechanics.
Yep.
It'll cost you a maneuver.
Now, I know something that helps sort of paint ranges in your mind is to think of them as bubbles or zones of space.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's no definite size to these zones of space. They're just a region of narrative existence.
Yeah.
And everything within that short range zone are locations that you have to move to and throw to get around.
Yeah.
You can't just reach across to the other side of the zone. You have to, if you want to actively move to it and affect the mechanics and the narrative, you have to spend that maneuver.
Because you're gaining a benefit.
Correct. The console that you want to interact with could be on one side of the short range zone, and the other console that you need to activate also is on the other side of the short range zone. So you're going to have to spend that maneuver to go from console A to console B, even though it's still within short range.
Yep.
It's all happening in that one little bubble.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's when difficult terrain can be a pain, because that would cost you two maneuvers to do it.
But this is where it gets complicated.
Yes.
So the first thing where it starts to get a little bit more complicated is if you want to move over, so you want to get to extreme range, but you're currently, well, your opponent's at extreme range.
Right.
So you're sitting where you are, and you need to close the distance. This is going to take you multiple turns, obviously.
Yep.
So in your first turn, you spend a maneuver to go from short to medium.
Yep.
You then spend another maneuver to go from medium to long. Wait a minute, that costs 2.
Exactly.
So you bank one maneuver because you've spent it, and then on your next turn, you can spend a maneuver to complete the movement from medium to long.
Yep.
and you've closed that distance. Now you need to keep track of where you are in that long range because it doesn't change. You don't, you're sitting at long.
Yep.
So your next turn, when you're determining how many maneuvers that you need to close that distance to your opponent, it's going to be 2 because you need to go from long to extreme.
That's right.
You don't recalculate at any point until you've closed with that person and you're sitting at engaged or what have you.
That's right. Yeah.
Honestly, this is the most tricky thing to wrap your mind around as a new player.
One more level.
I'm easing them into it, Martin. All right? You gotta keep the people happy.
You can't just tear the Band-Aid off.
Exactly. You gotta warn them it's gonna happen.
Okay.
But
this is quite tricky to get your brain around.
This element of the combat rules, I find, is the hardest to try and get your brain around, especially for new players.
Yeah. Now, we have solved it, but we're not necessarily going to go into that right now.
Well, the thing to keep in mind, the easiest thing to remember when you're trying to work this out, how I'm moving, don't recalculate.
Yep.
Never recalculate. Right? So your position relative to your opponent when you start is the same. Like you're moving across these range bands.
Yep.
So if you think of it like a picture and you've written down the range bands, you've got to cross these range bands to get your opponent.
Yep.
Don't recalculate that tree.
Yeah,
And that is the hardest part with this system, I think.
Because it gets
this
more
is
complicated when you add in a third party or a fourth party or a fifth party.
Right.
Because that don't recalculate thing is as written in the book.
Yep.
So there's this section called relative positioning.
Now, that's found on the sidebar on page 107 of the core rulebook.
The all-glorious sidebar.
So this sidebar and me don't get along.
I've seen them fight in a car park. It was like that.
There were glass bottles broken.
Well, it was like that scene in Fight Club. Martin was just fighting himself. He was hitting himself with the GeneSys rulebook. Come on. All right, each
and
their own.
He just nodded and walked away.
I did.
He didn't want to help.
No. I don't get between a man and a GeneSys rulebook.
just to channel Caitlin for a moment. Clearly, it was in a cage over a lava pit via tight ropes.
Absolutely. But basically, it breaks down to this. So if you've got 2 opponents, both are at long range to you, okay? So those 2 opponents are at medium range to each other.
Yep.
If you want to get close to one of them in order to engage them in melee.
Aww.
So, yeah, you're going to get engaged.
Get close, then get engaged.
Just get out your diamond ring. Get down on one knee. But to get there, you've got to, as you say, it was at long range, so it's going to take you 2 turns to get to that person. So the first turn, you spend 2 maneuvers, and you're at medium range and a half.
Right.
But you're still at long range to the other opponent.
Yeah.
This is where it gets tricky. You then spend, in your next turn, a maneuver to complete the movement to long range, and then a maneuver to engage that opponent.
Yep.
You're still at long range to the other opponent because you never recalculate unless you move relative to that opponent.
Yep.
So whilst your buddy that you're now engaged with might be at medium range to that person, you're at long.
Yes. A little bit confusing.
It's only relative to you.
That's right.
Now, this is another thing that we play loosey-goosey with. Yep. Often when you're at the table, you'll just let it go. And you'll just say, oh, you're at medium now.
Yeah.
Because when you ask the question of the storyteller, once you're at engaged, you've closed with the person that you were getting to, how far away am I from that person? The storyteller says medium range.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that suits the story.
That's right. Yep. So now that we've frightened off all of our options when it comes to movement, and we knew this was going to happen.
And if I'm wrong about this, if I've read that wrong, let me know.
Please correct
But that
me.
is...
Yeah, absolutely.
We've had discussions about this.
Martin will finally be able to sleep.
I will be able to sleep. But my reading of that relative positioning, it seems pretty literal. That's how it works.
Yep, that's right. Now, we have solved it, as I mentioned before, but we will go into that a little bit later on. when we talk about zones, which is something that Mike's mentioned all the way through the discussion.
I was dropping the name subtly. And now you've just blown it wide open.
Wow.
But there is a listener question that relates to it. So we'll discuss it later on. And we'll be a very brief discussion of zones.
Yeah.
But it's something we can talk about and get the main point across fairly easily.
Yeah.
It's maps, but don't be scared. They're not
Well,
maps.
they're not maps.
They're
as
zones.
such.
So
It's different.
zones.
But don't forget,
It's-
I don't like maps.
Okay,
So
don't
you
call it a map. Don't call it a map.
Oh,
It is a visual representation of the range bands.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yep, that is
And that's
right.
obviously that. Honestly, that's the most scary thing about this whole concept is pitching that to hardcore GeneSys players because
Well, it's not a map.
it's not a map, but it looks like a map. And players are like, "Oh, I'm not going to play off a map." It's like, well, good. I don't like maps either. I hate maps, but I love
agree.
this system, and
Yeah.
this system has changed our life for GeneSys and Star Wars,
Absolutely.
Especially
And we use it all the time.
especially Starship Combat.
It makes it so much simpler, and we will get into that. Let's not hype it up too
Yes.
much.
True. All right. So that's basically when we're talking about movement. Okay. So movement, very, very simple, is that to go from short to medium, one maneuver, to go from anywhere within short, it's one maneuver, to engage with an enemy.
Costs a maneuver.
Cost maneuver, okay, but don't look at that as like a range band. Look at that like a condition that you're applying to another opponent.
Especially because, and this is something I probably should have mentioned, if you're engaging with a friendly, it costs you a maneuver. But when you want to leave that space with your friendly,
It costs you nothing.
it costs you nothing. You have it, which is why it's better to think, well, it is much better to think of it as a condition, especially because if you've got a talent as well that allows you to travel like from short to medium, you can't then use that to engage with an opponent because that's a specific use of a maneuver.
That's right.
So you can get to short with your opponent, but you can't then close to engage without another maneuver.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, they're just a few minutiae things there. So to go from medium to long, 2 maneuvers. To go from long to extreme, another 2 maneuvers as well.
And don't recalculate.
And don't recalculate. So that's basically when it comes to that. So let's talk about ranges, as Martin mentioned before. So we basically have the, and we touch base on that. So we've got the engage range, which is basically where you're touching someone appropriately or inappropriately to hit them with a sword or something. I don't know. You've got short range, which is best probably described as that I can talk to you at normal volume. So if you're in the same room, that's effectively what short range is, depending on the size of the room, obviously. You've then got medium range, which is something that I'd have to raise my voice a little bit for me to be heard. And then you've got long range, which I have to shout. And then extreme range is where I have to shout at the top of my lungs and you could probably barely hear me. That's the easiest way to describe that, that I always apply when talking to new players anyway, of how range bands work.
See, once upon a time, I was very much, yes, this is how approximately a large range band should be.
Yep.
But I do have issues with it, especially now after playing the 2D20 system, where things go into 2D20 system uses what we just mentioned before, a system called zones.
Yeah.
Where it doesn't necessarily fix a meterage or distance or even approximation of that to a range band.
Yep.
Because if you say a short range is, the other side of a room, it's kind of weird that my pistol can only shoot to the other side of the room.
Yeah.
So if you are a little bit more generous in your mind's eye to what a range band is, you can start being a little more flexible in terms of how big they are. It's a super abstract system either way you look at it. But this whole system's abstract. But if someone asks you for a broad idea of how big a range band is, then exactly how GeneSys paints in the book is a great way to use as a baseline. I guess.
Yeah.
But you shouldn't necessarily be fixed to that concept because range bands are scalable. Range band style in vehicle combat shrinks or decreases in size depending on the size of the vehicle you're in.
I mean, the way that I think about it is short range is the size of a room. Yeah. How big is a room?
Exactly.
There's no definitive answer.
Yeah.
No, that's right.
And as soon as you break that, that needing to size as a range band, it opens up, as I said before, it opens up a lot more narrative utility for the GM and the players.
Yep.
Like, a one library's floor could be a short range band.
Yep.
It's filled with bookshelves and whatnot, but it still could only be one range band. And the GM could declare this is only a short range, but it's going to be difficult terrain to get across because you have to weave in and out of all those bookshelves.
Yeah.
Yep. And remembering that a round is a narrative time. So, it only might take you a maneuver to cross a small 4x4 room, but it also only takes you a maneuver to cross that library floor.
Absolutely.
Because you can take it at a run, or,
And
time passes faster.
And early in the episode, I mentioned, when you attack someone with a pistol, you're not necessarily standing still. You're actively moving around.
Yep.
Narratively, purely narratively. Mechanically, your positioning is not changing whatsoever unless you actually spend a maneuver to change position.
Or you're gaining a benefit from that.
Correct. Using the library floor as an example, yes, I can shoot my pistol at guys in the library, and unless they've positioned themselves in cover, it's assumed that I'm moving myself around to get shots at them.
Yep.
As they're hiding behind bookshelves and whatnot. But if my NPC has gone, well, I'm going to take cover behind these shelves, I'm going to take hard cover behind these shelves because the GM allows hard cover because there's a lot of line of sight blocking features.
Yep.
2 setback to attack these guys as I use my shotgun through the rows of shelves, and as I fire and cover takes effect, books explode, and etc. However, if I actually actively spend a maneuver, I could move around within that range band and get a clear shot at them.
Mm-hmm.
And range band, that's just one example of how much one range band can open up if you allow it to open up.
Yeah.
And that's probably some advanced rules. And that's again,
It simply boils down to keeping it narrative.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about
General ranges?
Yeah, we've talked about general ranges and what they actually are and what their names are. But let's very quickly just talk about ranges as far as weapons go, because as opposed to some systems where we're talking about, D&D as an example, and I know we keep going back to that, but that's what a lot of people are familiar with.
Although
they started.
we're not picking on it. There's a million other systems which use very complex range systems, so
Yeah,
it's not
that's
us
right.
picking on D&D at all.
But basically, they have a lot of them have a certain number of meters or feet in one range band, another number of feet in the next range band, another number, etc., etc., etc. But the way that GeneSys works is that the weapons have a maximum range listed as one of its characteristics. Now, this is the maximum range that it can shoot up to. So, for example, a weapon with a long range can shoot up to long range, while a weapon with a short range can only shoot at up to short range. Pretty much makes sense. Now, there are some attachments that obviously break the rule, like scopes and things like that, but we're not going to touch base on that here today.
And that's a hard and fast thing. You can't shoot beyond the maximum range of your weapon.
Correct. Now, obviously, the difficulty to then shoot at those range bands is pretty static as well. Okay, so that if you're shooting at short range, it is 1 purple die. If you're shooting at medium range, it's 2, long 3, extreme 4.
And if you're shooting at someone while you're engaged with them,
Yes,
there is a couple of modifiers to the difficulty.
there are.
If you've got a pistol, it's an additional purple dice, so 1 harder. If it's a heavy weapon,
Which brings it to 2 purple for the pistol.
that's correct.
Which is very similar to a traditional melee weapon.
Exactly.
It's always 2 purple.
That's right.
Pistols are good for this. If it is a
Rifle?
Two-handed
rifle,
Yep.
two-handed weapon, it will cost you 2 additional difficulty, so it's a hard check.
Yep.
If it is a gunnery weapon, like a bazooka or a
Yep.
Gatling gun,
It
no, you
cannot
can't
be.
do it.
No.
Come on, seriously. What were you even thinking?
Unless you swing that weapon as a rudimentary club.
That's true, an improvised weapon.
That's right.
Or you make or you have a bayonet attached to the end of it.
But there is
Stab.
something else, isn't there? If someone's attacking you while you've got a...
Yes.
This is something that gets missed often.
It is. Basically, if your opponent has attacked you with a ranged weapon while you're engaged with them,
Yep.
your upcoming attack with a melee weapon, you're going to get a boost dice to your attack. It is something we all forget all the time, up until just recently where I've been forcing myself to remember it, because it's one of those rules that has always existed since Star Wars, but everyone forever forgets about it.
That's right.
Because one of those little tiny rules that it's mentioned once in the rule book, super obscure, but it can make a big difference.
It can.
And it's a deterrent from using pistols in combat all the time. Or not pistols in combat, sorry. Any ranged weapon in combat. Because ultimately a ranged weapon should have... There's a reason why swords and bayonets exist.
Yeah.
Because it isn't always ideal to use those weapons in combat. Now, keeping in mind, engaged in the system, which we didn't really touch base on before, engaged isn't necessarily you hugging your opponent. No. It's within arm's reach or within reach without having to move around a whole lot.
Yeah, if you reach out your arm and you can tap them on the shoulder, you're in engaged range.
Exactly. Or you can reach down to your feet and pick something up. That's engaged to you. So engaged isn't a super tight space. It's fairly... Your arm span, I guess, is generally engaged.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of room for you to dance about John Wick style and use a pistol. And I use John Wick all the time as an example, but give me a better person to use the examples.
That is true.
They don't exist. But engaged is fairly loosey-goosey. So yes, using weapons like rifles and pistols is very possible, but there is going to be setbacks.
That's right.
Or in this case, boosts.
Yep.
And for those people who say, GM Huzz, you're wrong. Well, look at page 107 down the bottom. In the second bottom paragraph, it's there in black and white and blue because it talks about a booster.
Yep.
So anyway.
It's also worth mentioning that being prone, if you're fired at, is a setback dice to the attacker.
Correct.
If you're prone and being hit by a melee weapon, it's actually a boost dice to the attacker.
Right.
Yep.
Sidetrack a little bit, but they are other two rules that often get lost in the storm of rules.
Okay, so another thing that we can quickly touch base on is defense. Now, defense is something that affects the difficulty of the check and was recently errated in the latest FAQ. And that had a follow-on effect into Star Wars as well. So basically, defense is something that your character can get from things like cover, from talents, weapons that have the defensive quality, shields in the case of vehicles, and of course the guarded stance maneuver. Now, each of these increases your defense by 1 or more. Now, this is the number of setback dice that are applied to the difficulty of the check to attack you. Now, defense is split up into 2 types. Which is melee defense and range defense. Melee defense is when you're being attacked with either a brawl or a melee weapon, and range defense is applied when you are being shot at or something is being thrown at you. Pretty self-explanatory. Now, as per the errata, the most number of setback dice that can be applied due to defense is 4. Now that's limited. That's limited only to things which provide defense. Now I know we mentioned this in the last episode, but this does not include setback dice which come from the environment. For example, like smoke or fog or something like that. Nor from things like fear, critical injuries, or other conditions that may be applied, like poisons or something, that kind of, add to the difficulty of performing the task, but don't actually add to defense as such. Now, I think that pretty much covers that. So let's now talk about the weapons themselves. And how that actually works.
I believe you aim the barrel at someone and pull the trigger.
The pointy end goes into the opponent.
Yes.
It is the first point-click device.
All right, we're done. Next subject.
Sure. Right.
No. Well, basically, weapons, we have 2 types.
Yep.
Well, 3 types, actually.
There are
Ranged,
3. Yep.
gunnery, and melee.
Yep.
And brawl.
And brawl, so there's 4.
Yes, this is true.
Unless
I'm wrong.
Unless you've decided to go down the Terranoth path, in which case that there are 2 types of melee weapons, or if you go down the Star Wars path, where there are 2 types of ranged.
Yes.
Well, it's more about the skill that you use it. See, the way that I would break it down is into ranged weapons, melee weapons, and brawl weapons.
Yep, that's right.
The individual skill is something separate again,
Yes.
and is like a subcategory of that particular weapon.
And that will be listed on the stat block, I guess, for the weapon.
And that
what
is
skill you use.
That is actually something to keep in mind as well. And this is something that I ran into with difficulty with brawl weapons in Terranoth. Because a melee weapon, lowercase,
Yeah.
Is anything that you hit
is a
someone with.
melee, a melee attack is any close combat weapon, brawl or melee. If it's done with a capital M,
Yeah.
it is
A weapon that uses your melee skill.
yes.
Yeah.
And the same with ranged weapons. If it's got a capital, et cetera, et cetera. Ranged attacks are different to ranged weapons.
Really got to look out for those capitals. They make
And the exact
They do
wording
make a
that they
difference,
use, because ranged attack is different to ranged weapon.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're listening out there, FFG, there's lots of words in the English language. Just saying. Hashtag not a criticism.
No.
Is a criticism.
Well, it works,
It does. You just got to be
but
mindful
you could
of it.
make it a little bit clearer.
Yeah.
Because I remember because we discussed in the Terranoth episode, so this is a bit of a retcon for us.
Yeah.
Where GM Flano was upset by the lack of brawl weapons. And
Yes.
we actually had a closer look, and oh wait, no, they're lowercase m's.
Well, not brawl weapons, brawl talents and
Brawl
things like
talents,
that.
sorry.
There is a lot more that you have available
Yes.
to you. There is still issues with brawl weapons, but
The talents
I'm less miffed by this. If you,
Yes.
He got some sleep when we discovered this. It was good.
but no, I absolutely love this. You've just got to keep an eye on it.
But weapons, they have ranges.
They have ranges.
They
have skills.
They have skills types are associated to.
Yep.
They also have a damage value.
They do.
Now, the damage value is basically how much damage you deliver to your opponent.
Yes.
When you hit a weapon, let that be ranged or melee, you will deal additional damage equal to the number of successes you roll on the dice.
Yep.
So if you're using a pistol with damage of 5 and you get 3 successes, you're going to deal 8 damage to your opponent.
That's uncancelled successes.
Uncancelled successes, correct.
Yeah.
The interesting thing to remember when it comes to damage as well, when you're looking at it in the book, is that some damage will just have a standard number, and some damage will have a plus number.
Yeah.
If it has a plus number, your brawn is added to that skill.
Because this is
Or that
typically melee weapons and brawl weapons.
That's right. So whatever your brawn rating is, so if you've got a brawn rating of 3, and I'll just use what it's in the book, you've got a knife where it has a damage of +1. That means that if you've got a brawn of 3, you are doing 4 base damage plus the number of successes uncancelled that you've rolled in that check.
However, there are some talents that will allow you to use a different attribute for this.
For making the attack in the first
for the
place.
attack itself.
But using the different attribute to make the attack doesn't affect the damage output. You still use, in the case of melee weapons, with the plus damage, you still use your brawn.
Correct.
So yes, you attack with your agility, and you're probably going to get more successes because you're rolling, in the case of a rogue or a similar character to that archetype, you are rolling your better attribute. So you're going to be rolling more successes, which ultimately, at the end of the day, deliver more damage.
Yep.
So the baseline of the dagger, in this example, is still going to be using your strength for the damage output, but because of your finesse with the weapon, you're delivering more damage through your successes on the roll.
Correct. Very good.
Also,
Yes.
we've got damage. There's also critical. Now, this is something new players always ask me how it works.
Yep.
Basically, if your weapon has a critical rating, I'll say 3.
Yep.
If your net result in your attack roll scores you 3 or more advantages, you can spend those advantages to activate a crit.
Yep.
Assuming that you've dealt at least 1 uncancelled damage.
Correct.
That's also something a lot of players forget about.
And that's after soak.
Yeah, after soak.
After soak, yeah, absolutely. And we'll get into how that kind of works in the deck.
Well, that's a good point to bring it. Damage and wounds, 2 different things.
Yes.
To deliver a crit, you must deliver a wound.
True.
Yeah.
Because you can hit, which will apply damage, but then after soak, if there is damage left over, then
converts to wounds.
Converts to wounds.
And
And that's a very nuanced wording there.
Yep.
And be mindful of it, because that does affect a lot of talents and et cetera and other rules of the game.
parry, for example.
Yeah, and how, because it's how damage is dealt, how wounds are received. Because if you're not dealing damage, it can go bypass all soak
So basically, to summarize, the difference is when the rules mention the word damage. So when your weapon hits, it causes wounds or strain. However, when something says that it causes strain damage or wound damage, it basically bypasses soak. So the best example of this is on page 88 of the core rulebooks, where it mentions the stun quality and the stun damage quality. Now, basically, the stun damage causes strain the stun quality itself causes strain as opposed to wounds. But the stun damage quality adds on, because it can be obviously triggered, it adds on stun damage which cannot be soaked. So stun damage effectively bypasses your character's soak. Again, it's a very, very minor difference, similar to what we were talking about before about, melee with a capital M as opposed to melee with a small m. But it's very important when looking at weapon qualities in particular, as well as some talents. And also some environmental effects that come into play as well.
But the other thing about weapons is their qualities. There is a whole list of them in the book.
There are a bucket of them.
We won't go into all of those. But
and GeneSys even brings in some more with Terranov.
Yep.
And I believe they also have a couple more of them for Android Shadow of the Beanstalk as well.
Now, the biggest thing to remember for the qualities is most of them require advantages to activate. In most cases, it's 2 advantages.
Yep.
Unless it says otherwise.
Unless it says otherwise. Some are passive and will always take effect. So when you're looking at your weapon qualities in the book, make sure you know, 1, if it's passive or active. And secondly, if it is active, does it require fewer or more than 2 advantages to activate? So if I hit a weapon and say I get a total of 5 advantages, my crit rating of the weapon is 3. I have enough advantages to activate the crit. Sweet. Then I also have enough leftover advantages to activate the quality of the weapon and do further effects.
That's right.
Yep.
The other thing, talking about crits very quickly as well, is that if you've got enough, let's say, for example, you've got a crit rating of 2 and you've rolled 4 advantages, okay, you don't do what I've heard some other podcasts do and I've seen in actual play, is that they applied to lots of crits. That's not how it works.
That's correct.
You basically only get critted once per hit. Now, I say that specifically because of auto fire.
And 2 weapon fighting.
So if you have only got 1 weapon that you've used and you've gained 4 advantages and it's got a crit rating of 2, what will happen is you only crit once, but the extra 2 advantages can be used to add 10 to your critical hit roll.
It's not always 2. It's basically, think of it this way. If you could potentially activate a crit multiple times, each additional activation of the crit gives you a plus 10 to the roll. So if you had a crit rating of a horrible weapon of 4, you're going to need to roll 8 advantages before you can potentially crit once, then activate the crit again at a plus 10. So most likely a crit 4 weapon is only going to trigger a crit once.
Yes.
But that's when low-level crit weapons like daggers and whatnot, like in Star Wars, there is weapons which have crit ratings of 1 and 2, which becomes very, very scary in very specific tailored hands, where you can see 1 dagger instantly kill a NPC through the combination of critting multiple times and qualities like vicious. And talents.
And lethal blows.
Lethal blows, there you go.
But if you've got 2 daggers, for instance, and you hit with 1 and crit, and activate the second hit from the other weapon and crit, that is 2 distinctly separate rolls for crits.
Correct.
Because it's per attack, as you say.
Exactly. Or it's per hit.
Per hit, sorry.
I think it's what they say. So if you've got auto fire, for example, if you've managed to activate that multiple times and you've got enough to do, like I've seen people roll 10 advantages. I'm looking at you, Mun.
Hey.
I often roll 10 advantage, but no successes.
That's always the most difficult, isn't it?
It's a mute point, really. Hypothetically, I could crit 1 million times. Hypothetically.
So if you've basically got enough to do auto fire, which you only need 2 advantages, if you've spent the additional upgrade or not upgrade, increase the difficulty by 1 to utilize that, and that's under the weapon quality description. If you've got enough to do crits as well, you can do it per hit.
Which
Simple
is
as that.
you're gonna need a lot of advantages to really make that worthwhile.
That is true.
But if you do it, then cool. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
I mean, ultimately, it's probably better to spend the advantages on doing more hits.
Well, yeah.
Now-
It depends on how you roll, I guess. But linked fire. Does linked fire count as 2 separate hits?
It does.
So linked fire is a good example of it then, because you're limited to maximum of the linked fire quality.
Yep.
Quality rating, I should say. And that's also something we should mention real quickly about qualities.
Yes.
A lot of qualities have ratings.
Yes.
Like Pierce is a good example.
Yeah.
If a weapon has Pierce 3 and you hit a target, it will ignore or bypass 3 of the target's soak. So if I hit you with my Pierce 3 weapon, the NPC treats soak as 3 lower.
Correct.
So a soak of 5 would become soak 2 for the purposes of the incoming damage,
Yep.
which is huge because that means more damage gets through and gets converted to wounds.
I mean, we didn't really mention soak earlier, but it is your value of soak gets subtracted from your uncancelled successes on the check.
Yeah.
Easy put. I mean, I think everyone knows that, but best to just say it.
If you've never played this
If you've
game
never
before,
played this game, I'm not sure why you're listening to us if you haven't. At this point, anyway, there's a better episode to start with.
yes, that is true.
The other thing that I want to mention that comes under weapons, there are 2 systems that always get a little bit confusing that I want to mention. Unarmed combat or brawl weapons.
Right.
So when you're looking at your profile for an unarmed weapon, profile for a brawl weapon, you've got your basic unarmed profile, right? And then you add your brawl weapon. Now, you always take the better of the 2 profiles.
Right.
So if you've got, your unarmed profile just does brawn damage, so you take the better. So you've got like a brass knuckles. So it's got a +1.
Right.
So you're going to take the damage from that. Say the special pair of brass knuckles has a crit of 2. You're going to use that crit. But say it had 6 crit, you would only use your base unarmed profile
'Cause
crit
it's got a
rating,
crit of 5.
which is a crit of 5.
Right.
The other thing to keep in mind is the item qualities. You keep all item qualities of your unarmed attack profile plus any of the weapon that you're using.
So you're basically keeping disorient and knockdown.
Yep. And the option to do non-lethal unless the weapon is a lethal weapon.
Yep.
So, yeah, it gets complicated. But keep that in mind because sometimes it can be better to use your base profile or qualities from that.
Yep.
The other thing is 2-weapon fighting. This one's a little bit more
Always a
complicated.
popular thing if you're jumping across from one part of the room to the other, and that's what we were talking about before. That was the thing that came into my mind, John Woo style, where you're basically jumping across
With doves.
with doves, and you're leaping across the room sideways with both weapons firing in slow motion.
Or, for the gamers out there, Max Payne.
Right. See, I just went face off, but I'm old.
See, Max Payne is the god of the bullet time dodge. Have you ever played Max Payne video game?
Yes.
Back in the early noughties?
Yep.
He established the amazingness of that. Bullet time in a video game, diving slow mode as you fire 2 pistols.
Right.
Best feeling in the world, never gets old.
Nice. Very good.
John Woo was like, I like that. And he made a million movies about that. He just changed by adding doves. Or it could have been the other way around. I don't know. I'm just basing my facts off nothing.
But basically, the way that it works is you pick 2 weapons.
Yep.
That are each one-handed or can reasonably used in one hand.
Yep.
So each of them, one of them will get designated as the primary weapon. And that's the one that you basically do all of your shooting with.
Yep.
The check's going to be upgraded once for the difficulty. So generally, if it's a melee weapon, it's going to be a hard check.
Now, for range weapons, just real quick, it has to be a ranged light.
Yes, that is true.
Because it's going to be a one-handed weapon.
It has to be ranged light. It can't be ranged heavy weapon with a pistol grip or anything fancy like that. It must be a ranged light. If you could get a ranged heavy weapon to become range light through some upgrade or means, awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, because ranged light weapons are essentially one-handed weapons.
Yep.
That's sort of how you look at it. But you've got your primary weapon, the difficulty is upgraded, and you use that profile of your primary weapon for most things, except when we're looking at how you assemble your dice pool. Now, say, because you can mix a ranged light weapon with, say, a brawl weapon. They both use 2 different skills. So you would use whichever is the
Worst.
Well, yes, whichever is the worst of the skill, and whichever is worst of the attribute.
Yep.
So that's how you've got to assemble your dice pool. There's a little bit of finagling about it.
When you're using 2 pistols, it's no big deal.
Two identical pistols.
Two identical pistols.
Yeah.
It only becomes a little bit more complex when you're doing melee and pistols at the same time.
Or melee and brawl.
Yeah, true.
But it gets really complicated when you're using, as you say, a ranged light weapon and a melee weapon.
Yep.
Because then you're using agility for the gun and brawl for the the dagger or whatever it is. And brawn agility for the
weapon and
brawn for the
yes.
Anyway, but you're also using ranged light and melee.
Yeah.
So you've got to pick the worst of both of those separately. So say you've got a high brawn, but a much higher ranged light skill. You'd use brawn and I think I completely got myself messed up. But you use whichever's the worst. So if you're higher agility, then you're going to use brawn. If you're higher melee, you're going to use ranged light. So you could end up in a situation where you're firing with brawn and a ranged light weapon skill.
Yeah, exactly.
It's basically you're never, ever going to be able to fool the system and make yourself godly in another profile, another characteristic somehow. No. You're always going to use the worst pool. Other combination of things. Quick aside, just came to my mind, that talent which allows you to use finesse. Sorry, not finesse. The finesse talent which allows you to use agility for melee weapons, for light melee weapons. You could run around as a rogue with a hand crossbow and a dagger.
Absolutely.
And use the same attribute on both
and it
attacks.
works really well. That's absolutely a wonderful use for it. But the other thing is that you've got a second weapon in your hand. When does it come into play? Basically, once you've made your roll using the modified dice pool, if you roll 2 advantages, you score a hit with your offhand weapon. And everything, and then you apply any qualities that item has. Now, you basically ignore all negative qualities for that offhand weapon because you're only using the profile for the primary weapon. So, for instance, if it's inaccurate, that doesn't count. That doesn't get added into the dice pool. But if it is, say, superior, when you hit with that weapon, you're going to add an automatic advantage to your to the result. Interesting things to keep in mind.
Yeah, the 2-handed weapon rules on the surface level are quite straightforward. But they can quickly become bonkers. So as a GM, you have to be mindful of your players playing this right if they start getting tricky with it. As a player, you need to be aware that you're using it right and understand the rules fully. Otherwise, you could get yourself in a situation where you're inadvertently playing it wrong and cheating or detrimenting yourself. Either either.
Ripping yourself off.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And I got myself a little bit fuddled earlier, so if something's not clear, hit me up, and I will clarify after the show.
Or they can look on page 108 where it's listed there. At the bottom of the left-hand paragraph, and goes for, another 3/4 of a page in column. So there's a lot there. The other thing that you have to take into consideration when doing the 2-weapon combat as well is that you take the worst difficulty for the check. So if you're using a light, like a pistol or something like that, where it's a difficulty of 1, and the weapon that you're using, the weapon that you're using, on the other hand, has, say, a difficulty of 2, you would make the check at 2 difficulty. In addition, you also increase the difficulty by 1. So if you're using a pistol, or let's say you're using a knife in one hand and your fists in the other, They both have a difficulty of 2, but you would then upgrade that, or not upgrade, sorry. You would increase the difficulty to 3.
I should have also said that you don't add accurate. So with 2-weapon fighting, basically, and I should have said this clearer before, but if it's a quality on your offhand weapon that adds to your dice pool when you're rolling, it doesn't come into play.
Right.
It's only if it's something that activates on a hit.
Right.
Right? So Pierce, for instance, will come into play.
Right.
Accurate won't because it's adding a dice to your roll. You've
Right.
already rolled. It doesn't come into play if you roll 2 advantages and hit.
Right.
Sorry, just to clarify.
Well, speaking of muddy environments,
Yes.
like the two-handed weapon rules,
Yes.
let's talk about environments.
Cool. Good segue.
Environments can make or break the interesting factor of a combat. A combat in a boring, nondescript area gets stale pretty fast when people just shooting each other behind walls and cover and etc. Boring.
It does.
But if you spice that up, inject a narrative stuff into the combat, it gets very interesting very fast.
Yeah.
And the more things you inject, the more things that are there, and more props that players have to play with, the more fun your players will have, and the more chance to extrapolate the scene and what's going on. It'll unfold as you play. Now, environment can be anything from, real world things, rain, weather, etc., day, night, atmosphere, all bits and pieces. It also encompass what's there, as I was saying before. And I'll go back to the library example that I used moments before.
Absolutely.
A library, that's your environment. It's an area that the GM describes. It's full of bookshelves, counters, etc. Lots of cover, lots of interesting things for your players to interact with. A player could run up and shove a bookshelf because there's a bad guy at the other end of the library and it creates a domino effect and the shelves fall down.
And he gets squished. Now, if I didn't make that clear to the players where they were, that thing would never come up. The player would never have the opportunity to think of that. But by just saying there's bookshelves and he rows and rows of bookshelves, the players can go, all right, sweet, how can I use these bookshelves for our benefit? Covers one. Knocking them over to create barricades, or a dominoes effect for the meme, because that'd be hilarious to kill the villain of the of your narrative in the final combat by squishing with the bookshelf. Hurling books as improvised weapons.
Exactly.
I was actually thinking like magic to have all of the books fly out of the shelves and be used as a ranged weapon.
Yeah, absolutely. Magic's great. Magic's a perfect example of it. You spend an advantage or roll a triumph in the middle of combat and a book falls down in front of your mage, which happens to be a spellcasting book, and he rips it open and learns a new spell.
Yep.
There's so much you can do with that environment. Then all of a sudden, due to some effect, the roof of the library gets blown off and the thunderstorm that had been raging outside is now inside. The environment has shifted. It's now pouring down rain inside the library. All the bookshelves have been toppled over. There's no clear corridors or paths anymore. So the GM declares, all right, everything's now going to be in difficult terrain. It's now bucketing down rain. So you're going to be in difficult terrain, so 2 maneuvers to move anywhere.
Yep.
And because of this rain, 2 setback dice in all your checks. Simple as that. And that's your environment set. And by taking one simple location and spicing it up with environmental stuff, it makes it a lot more interesting very quickly.
Yep. And it allows your players to use their talents and stuff to overcome that environment.
Absolutely. But you can also add to that as well when you're rolling triumphs and advantages and threats and whatever else, that you can keep adding to the environment, keep adding to the scene to make it, spice it up even more.
Well, heck, I'm fighting someone on one of these corridors of shelves, looking my 2 pistols out. There's no way jumping back and forwards between an imagery of a fantasy setting and a real world setting. The library's a library. I'm John Wicking it backwards, firing both my pistols. I roll a triumph in my pistol check.
Yep.
As I'm diving backwards, because, I'm cool, there's a library book cart. I land in the library book cart and I slide backwards down the shelves and it moves me an extra range band as I fire the pistols at my target at the end of the corridor.
Yeah, that's cool.
All right.
So there's so much you can do.
For that description, I would be giving a booster. Because that is cool.
That is the factor of environments. Make every single combat in an interesting environment, if you can.
Yep.
Obviously, it's not always going to be easy to do, but if you look at any movie where there's a gunfight, a sword fight, etc., there's always something interesting about it. More than just the people that's on the screen. There's going to be a location. One that jumps to mind is Highlander, where they're fighting in the car park. and they're in that crowded underground car park having a sword fight, a medieval style sword fight. All these other modern world things going on around them. And that's an interesting environment that makes that, what would just be a sword fight, so much more interesting to watch.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, combat on any sort of action film never occurs just in a bubble, never occurs in an empty room. Well, maybe it does. But the thing is that putting stuff in the way is probably a really good rule of thumb to make stuff interesting.
Yep.
Because the more you put into an environment, and it doesn't need, and this goes back to something that we'd sort of discussed about earlier, is that you use your senses to describe the scene, to put stuff in there, and then bounce off the players. The players will come up with ideas, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, put stuff in the way.
And don't overthink it too. You don't have to describe every single feature of an environment. Because if you're not pre-scripting your encounters, which a lot of us probably don't, you don't want to try and go, okay, there's a bench over here, there's a bookcase over here, there's a toppled over statue here. Don't do that. Be vague. Describe your room with enough details to get the information across.
Broad strokes.
Broad strokes. It gives players tools to play with in terms of the narrative.
Yep.
If you describe those senses that GM Hooly just discussed, that will also help paint the picture. If there is key features to an environment that you want the players to take notice of, highlight them. You're in an apartment with giant floor-to-ceiling windows along one side.
Yep.
That's an immediate prop piece straight away. Because, if you're watching an action movie and a fight takes place in an apartment with those windows...
They have to be broken at some point.
Exactly. Perfect example is Watchmen. The very, very start of that film, when the comedian and the unknown assailant are fighting, you know straight away someone's going through those windows, even if you haven't read the comic. Sure enough, they go through the window.
Yeah.
Or, in other scenes and environments, a gunship floats up to those windows and fires its Gatling guns through the windows. They set a sense of foreboding.
Yeah.
As simple as just saying floor-to-ceiling windows.
Double doors.
Double doors, yeah. Well,
Large double doors.
Yes.
Bosses behind this.
Okay, so that's the narrative side of things, but we should mention that there are a heap of rules when it comes to the mechanical side of environment as well. Now, these things are like concealment, cover, difficult terrain, which impacts upon movement, which we touched on earlier, gravity, water and swimming, the vacuum of space, fire, acid, corrosive atmosphere, and I'm just reading off the list, basically. Now, however, environmental effects are a huge topic that we could literally go on for hours about, but so that we don't actually turn this into an over 3-hour podcast, we're going to save that for another topic on another day, because that's going to be pretty cool, I think. So having said all that, just know that the environment can have a big impact on your combat encounters, both narratively, as we've spoken about, but also mechanically. So have a good look at those rules and see how it's going to impact on your game. All right, so we've discussed actions and incidentals and how that they work, along with maneuvers. We've talked about movement briefly, which we'll get on to a little bit more later on, because we have a listener question specifically asking about how to do movement in the system. But we've basically covered the absolute, the nitty-gritty of how movement works within combat. We've talked about ranges, we've talked about weapons, and how they sort of work in with ranges. We've talked about initiative, and we've obviously talked about damage and soak and how that applies. And then lastly, we've talked about environment to make your action scene, your combat, just that little bit more exciting. Okay, so before we close this topic off, there are two other things we need to talk about, and that's improvised weapons and silhouette. These are probably the two things that come up very often during a session. So, firstly, improvised weapons. These appear on page 109. In fact, both elements that we're going to talk about quickly are on that page. And they show that an improvised weapon is something that you would, pick up, use off the ground like a table or a chair or a rock or whatever. And there's 3 types of improvised weapons. There's small, medium, and large. And each one of those has a +1, +2, and +3 base damage, respectively. So, in other words, you add your brawn onto that. So, Michael, what's some good examples of some improvised weapons?
Well, I think a common one that we've all seen in all westerns and other movies that have a bar fight brawl is a stool or a chair.
Right.
Pick them up, smash them over someone's head. That's probably the most common one. Broken bottles, lengths of just timber or metal bars. Generally stuff that you would find just laying around and discarded. I think are the most common sort of improvised weapons that you would find.
Yep. So now each of these, when you use them, they provide you with an automatic threat. Now that's
because of the inferior quality, I believe.
Yeah,
isn't it? Yes.
Exactly. So that applies to any attack check to use that item. Now this can be obviously negated with advantages. But the GM can spend, when an improvised weapon is used, he can spend either a despair or 2 threat to break the item, thus rendering it useless.
Yeah, and that's a good representation of the fact that, unlike a sword or some other weapon designed for melee, won't necessarily break if a threat or, multiple threats or a despair is rolled. They just suffer 1 level of damage in most cases. But you hit someone over the head of a chair, chances are it's going to shatter if you hit them hard enough. And that's why there's only 2 threat to break an improvised weapon because they aren't designed to be for hitting people, I guess.
True. Now, the other thing to consider, though, also is that the large item, so the large improvised weapon, that it has to be used in 2 hands as opposed to the small and the medium. That's obviously applying only when it's a silhouette 1 or less. So if you're a silhouette 0 person, or silhouette 1, then basically you have to use 2 hands. Silhouette 2?
If silhouette 2, not so much. If you're a big ogre or something like that, you can reap the benefits of being able to swing boulders and other larger things as an improvised weapon. And that brings me back to that game we ran a while ago that I was test playing a setting of mine when everyone was in the little power armored suits. Fighting you and Martin were fighting the giant. And you guys were tossing like chunks of masonry at the giant and he was chucking chunks of masonry at you guys. All on that cliff face of the ruined building. There was a improvised weapon fight, that one. That was really fun.
Yeah, that was cool.
Because you don't see it very often. But.
No, not at all. And that doesn't apply to shields with Terranoth either. You can just use a shield as a normal weapon.
Yeah, it has its own. I can't recall. Does it have its own?
It's got
a attack stat. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, which is cool. Pick up someone's helmet and you're using an improvised weapon.
Yeah,
which is cool. Now, one last thing with regards to improvised weapons is that both the medium and large improvised weapons both have the cumbersome quality. The medium has cumbersome 2, and the large has cumbersome 4. Now, what is the cumbersome?
Now, cumbersome appears on a lot of big weapons throughout Genesis and, in turn, Star Wars, of course. Now, essentially, in most cases, if you're a combat dude, you're not too worried about cumbersome because you're going to have high brawn anyway. But how cumbersome works is for every point the cumbersome is over your brawn, you increase the difficulty of your checks made using that item. Right. So if it's cumbersome 4 and you only have brawn 2, you're going to be increasing, and that's adding dice, not upgrading dice, increasing the check by adding 2 purple dice. So suddenly your melee check, which is normally 2 purple, is suddenly now 4 purple because you're having to exert so much more effort in swinging such a large weapon that you just haven't got the raw strength to use efficiently.
Right. So that means, Ben, that the medium one has cumbersome 2. So if you've got a brawn of 1, you're going to be throwing this weapon around with a difficulty of 3 purples.
On average,
Wow.
In most cases. It's also, cumbersome isn't isn't necessarily just a representation of the raw weight. It can also be how big and awkward the weapon is too.
Yeah.
You know,
Like picking up a table or
yeah, exactly.
Like
you can do
table.
it, but how well can you hit someone off a table is a different story. So, yeah, it's interesting.
True. Very
It's a
good.
simple mechanic, and it's also worth noting that you keep an eye. GMs keep an eye on a lot of other weapons
Yep.
out there that players may use with cumbersome, because it's one of those qualities that sort of slips under the radar. So just keep your eyes peeled for that.
Cool. Now, let's talk about silhouette very quickly. So, Michael, what's the sort of the update with silhouette?
Well, silhouette obviously is a rating of how overly large something or someone is. A normal person is silhouette 1, so that gives you your ballpark where to start.
Yep.
Small things which are carried by a person are silhouette 0. Now, there's a little bit of difference from GeneSys to Star Wars.
Yeah,
here,
absolutely.
is that little things like Jawas and etc. were always sort of considered to be silhouette 0.
Yeah.
However, in GeneSys, they've more defined silhouette 1 to be anything that's substantially living.
Yep.
0 is basically anything to be carried with ease. I think it's a general good rule of thumb.
Yep.
So yes, silhouette ranges from obviously 0 all the way up to 8 and beyond.
Yep.
Now, obviously, you start getting to some pretty massive scales when you get up to 8. Silhouette is one of those things too where it's not meant to be an exact thing.
No, it's
not
a very
an
abstract thing.
It is very abstract. Like you can usually, when you're playing, when players interacting with things on the tabletop in a combat, generally, unless vehicles are involved, they're not really going against anything much bigger than 3, because that's quite large. You go to 4 and above, and you start getting to starships and very large vehicles and that sort of thing. Now, there is something worth mentioning about silhouette, and that's when you attack things with a silhouette larger than your own.
Yep.
Now, GeneSys does streamline this from Star Wars. I believe in GeneSys, if the silhouette is greater than yours, to represent the fact that it's easier for you to attack because it's so
Greater than
big.
2. It's
Greater than 2, is
Yep.
it? Sorry, greater than 2. You simply decrease the difficulty of the check once. And that doesn't matter how much bigger it is for you to attack.
No, that's right.
It's just a straight up decrease of 1, which is easy to track, very easy to track.
In comparison to Star Wars, where there was like an entire chart on it that sort of says, well, if it's this size, it's this, and if it's this size, and it just got a little bit out of control.
Exactly. And in a lot of cases, it didn't really matter to a certain point because you're only rolling a couple of dice for your difficulty in most cases anyway,
Yeah.
unless you're a mile away from the target. So the increases, if you're smaller than the silhouette, didn't really make much of a difference. It's sort of arbitrary in most cases. GeneSys has realized that and has embraced a much more simple system in tracking, how hard things are to hit.
Yep.
If they're bigger or smaller than you.
So basically, if it's 2 categories larger than you, so if you're a silhouette 1, as soon as it hits a silhouette 3, it means that you are taking away a difficulty die. And if you're walking around in your big size 4 mech and you're wanting to shoot at a smaller mech that might be a silhouette 2, that's going to be an increase.
Increase the attack.
Because it's smaller than you. Very simple. Now, I know that we've discussed a lot of things tonight, and I've already sort of gone through a summary of what we've already talked about. And we've probably missed a couple of things. Combat is a huge, huge chapter of the book. If we have missed anything,
I think we have, or more in-depth stuff.
Yeah.
I think we can go into in the future.
well, exactly. If we want to go into looking at equipment, the nitty-gritties of that, and stuff like that. So, if there is anything that you'd like us to talk about in that regard, let us know. And of course, if we've said anything that's wrong, I'm sure they'll let us know. But anyway, so yeah, we can always do those in follow-up episodes. So, anything that extra that you want to talk about in closing, Michael?
There's one thing I wanted to add in the initiative section.
Sure.
And that's something that's completely unnecessary, and that's pre-rolling initiative checks for your NPCs.
Yes.
If you're doing a fight where you're planning ahead for it, roll your initiatives and write the values next to the initiative, the NPC names.
Yep.
So if you've got 2 groups of stormtroopers, Group 1 has rolled a 1.2. Group 2 has rolled 3.3.
Yep.
Straight away, as soon as the fight starts, you as the GM, you've done your bit already.
Yep.
Because it doesn't matter when you roll that; those numbers are fixed because you don't know what the players are going to roll.
Yep.
So you can just go, all right, well, here's mine. What have you guys rolled? And you'd be surprised how much that speeds up initiative.
Something which is really, really important, which I know from running my own module for Star Wars, is that when you're writing an adventure for whether it be a convention or whatever else, time is a factor. Certainly it applies with what you're saying, Mike, but when you're writing an adventure, always make sure that you do that as well.
Yep.
Because that will just speed up play so that you just need to worry about what the players are rolling. You don't need to worry about what the NPCs.
There's one other trick as well that you can use, similar theory. I read this online a while ago. I don't know who mentioned it. I saw it somewhere. I thought it was a really good idea. As a GM, and this applies to almost any system which uses a similar initiative system. You use in D&D if you wanted to, but it works really well for this system. What you do, you just roll a heap of initiative checks.
Right.
You write them down in the order they fall, and then once combat starts, you just work your way down that pre-written list of initiative values and assign that to NPCs. It speeds up play, and it's really good if you've got unscripted combats coming up. Where combat comes up, and you're not planning for it. You go, all right, I'm going to add these values to these initiative slots. These
Roll
NPCs.
up a bunch of stormtroopers.
Well, honestly, what I'll do, I'd roll a fixed value and just average it out. So yes, some higher speed NPCs may roll more dice, usually if you rolled for them, but it balances out when lower speed initiative NPCs roll higher than average. So the law of averages sort of works itself out. Yes, it's not as to the raw, not at all, but it does speed up play, and time of play is something that's probably the most expensive thing that none of us can really afford. We all struggle to get around the table at a certain time and play. Let's treasure every moment and not spend half an hour rolling dice for initiative.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree with that. That's very good. Martin, do you have any final thoughts about combat and maybe a couple of tricks?
I think I've pretty much said the things that came to mind as we went along. But as always, don't get bogged down in the rules. If there's an argument over, this talent does that or whatever, just listen to your DM, sort it out later.
Yeah. Don't start flipping through rule books.
Nothing kills combat faster than book diving.
Yeah, and it's okay to we're not saying never look at a rule book, but if you actively have to pause a combat and have everyone sit around twiddling their thumbs, don't do that.
They take long enough as it is.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I think the best rule of thumb in that regard is just for the GM at the start to just give his boilerplate, as I did in Star Trek last night, is that, I don't know the system very well. If you've never ever played before with GeneSys, just say, I don't know all the rules, but I'm going to make some rulings as we progress, which may be completely wrong, but it's not going to be aimed to go against the players in any way, shape or form. All that it's going to be therefore is to speed up play and make things just that little bit more streamlined.
Yep.
And at the end of the session, you can retcon stuff if you want to go down a path, or, you can clarify some details and have a discussion after the session when it's not impacting everybody else.
Yep.
That's what I would
clarify for the future.
Absolutely. As far as the thing that I would, as far as a useful tip, which, when it comes to where do you start combat? Okay. Because obviously it's going to be dependent on the scenario that you're playing with, but you want to give your players a bit of room to play with. I would always recommend, starting at either long or medium range. Because that way that you're giving your players a little bit more scope to move around the scene, to rather than sort of you're suddenly in amongst short range. You're sort of limiting as to where you can go. Just as a rule of thumb, if you're wanting to set up how you see a scenario, long and medium range. Yeah,
it is very heavily scenario established, but it's a good general rule of thumb.
Yep.
Like if you're in the middle of a social encounter and it goes wrong, chances are you're going to be probably short range to all the guys who've just pissed off.
But as a general rule of thumb,
Yeah.
medium to long range is a kind of a bit of a ballpark that you should be aiming for.
Also, a GM tip.
Yep.
If you have a minion group with like 1 or 2 wounds left over, and a player, you want to help speed up the combat, don't be afraid of just going, you've killed the minion group.
Yeah.
It's having one minion group hanging around for an extra round. It adds an extra round of combat.
Yeah.
So if you think it's for the better of the speed of play, don't be afraid of just removing that minion group, because it's just a minion group. And if things change, you need another minion group in there, spend a story point and another minion group, airdrops in or however.
Yep.
So don't be afraid to take minion groups away, because you as a GM have an unlimited number of them. So if you feel combat starting to slow down and drag out, and the big key bad guys are dead, have the NPCs run away, or they magically take 1 or 2 extra wounds and don't tell the players when they get shot or attacked. It speeds up gameplay and keeps momentum going.
Yeah. Or have them, if there's like multiple groups of minions,
Or join up,
have the minion groups join together.
It's another way of doing it.
Wipe out one and add another number to the other one.
Why not?
That's you can do that narratively, and it's sort of like, right, well, they're rallying the troops type thing. So that kind of works as well. Well, hopefully that has given you a little bit of scope as to how to run combat. There's a whole heap of other things, obviously, that come up with combat, and some tips and tricks for making them streamlined during combat. But I think we've covered all the basics. So
And added some advice from our own playtime.
And optional rules.
Definitely. So, if you've got some rules that you use in your games, let us know on social media.
Because we won't steal them.
No, not at all. Of course we will.
No, I love those ambush rules.
Yeah. Lots of stuff to discuss. Perhaps we should get to some listener questions. What do you think?
I think we should do some behind the scenes instead.
Oh, sounds like a plan.
Behind the screens.
And welcome to Behind the Screens, the segment where we will answer your games and rules questions regarding the GeneSys role-playing game. And we've got a few questions, all mostly to do with combat. We've got another one there which we'll get onto shortly. But Mike, would you like to take us through the first question?
Sure. Theo Fattel asks via the Facebook, while GeneSys can easily be played without a map, sometimes battles can get hairy as PCs and adversaries maneuver about. Is there a good method of keeping track of various ranges everyone is from everyone else as the fight develops?
Well, as we have alluded to, and we've dodged around, like we've got the talent, there certainly is. Now, we've developed our own, as we talked about before, when it comes to maneuvers.
Oh, yeah, because relative positioning is the official answer, but it gets complicated.
Absolutely. And it becomes very, very complicated when you start really getting into it, as Martin has mentioned during the core of the show.
Relative positioning is fine, as so long as you have a handful of people.
Yes.
Because it says it's up to the player to keep track of where they are relative to others.
Yeah.
So
That's right.
it's a good system up until a point.
Yep.
And I think it's fair to say most people play it differently anyway.
Yes. They do.
But we have recently come up, when I say we've come up, and recently we have more or less been inspired by the zone rules from the 2D20 system by Jay Little.
Yep.
Now, for those who aren't familiar with the 2D20 system, it's a system owned by Modifius, I believe, which is another developing studio. Very, very great bunch of dudes over there. They develop Infinity, Star Trek Adventures, Conan, Mutant Chronicles, and the upcoming John Carter RPG. And all of them use the 2D20 system. Now, we mentioned the 2D20 system at the very start of this episode, so I won't go too much into details of that. But it does have one really, really cool mechanic called zones. Now, zones are an abstract tracking of narrative space. A single zone can be anything the GM deems it to be. It could be a house. as one zone, its backyard as another zone, the street out the front of the house
There's another one.
is another zone, and the park beyond the back fence is another zone.
Or it could be each room in the house is its own zone.
Exactly. It just completely comes down to however the GM wants to run that fight. Now, we've been working on a way to implement a very similar system to GeneSys, and we think we have come up with something that's quite good. Now, we use it a lot.
I think it's pretty elegant.
It's great. Now, as you mentioned earlier on, it's not a map. So don't be afraid. We're not bringing maps to GeneSys. You don't need miniatures or anything like that. But tokens and etc. to track, as Theo has asked, to track all those nitty-gritty things once a combat starts getting crunchy is very important. It helps the players keep track of what's going on. It helps the GM keep track of what's going on.
It removes that question of, where am I relative to this person, especially when you've got 5 different groups of enemies on the table or more. Large combats.
Yep. And it also
makes it so simple.
It also helps you remove that, carry the one when it comes to movement.
Yes.
When talking about when you're moving from like medium range
over multiple turns.
Yeah.
So now I could talk about zones for a long time and get very crunchy with them, but I'm going to give the elevator pitch on the zones.
Absolutely.
Zones are, as I said earlier, each zone's a narrative bubble. Now, in terms of GeneSys, a zone is almost always short range. Forget short range being the size of a room. Short range is whatever narrative space the GM wants to assign to short range.
Yes.
So it could be a house, could be a short range zone if you're not too worried about tracking down the individual sections of a house. Think of it that way. Now, so obviously, if one zone's short range, I'll use a pistol as an example again. My pistol can reach anywhere within that short range zone.
Yep.
Simple as that. Now, every 2 range bands is another range band. Every 2 zones is another range band. So up to 2 more zones away is medium range.
Yep.
Up to 4 more zones away is long range. Up to 6 zones away and beyond is extreme range. So what this allows you to do is track where your positioning is. So if I want to move one zone, it's just one maneuver.
Yep.
So if I move 2 maneuvers, I go out to the very far reach of medium range. And it's one more maneuver from there to jump into long. Now, this doesn't do an exact translation of how movement works in GeneSys, but it does a very functional alternative way of doing your movement and how far you're going.
Because it's a visual representation, and it does work out with the carry the one, the halfway, it does work out.
Yeah, absolutely.
We did a lot of maths on this to make sure that it fits right. There is a little bit of a funniness at one point, but it's so minute that you will not. It shouldn't come up.
The one little bit of funniness is much, much simpler to get your head around than the lot of funniness that
otherwise
the proper system has.
And the thing that this does well is that engaged is a status condition.
Correct.
So if you're in short, you can engage with someone.
Exactly. If I'm sharing a zone with a bad guy, I spend maneuver to gain the engaged status. I move or walk up to and engage with that person who I'm already within short range of. If we're using the house as an example of one zone, I move from the front door to the back door and engage with this guy.
Yep.
I haven't left the zone. I'm still in that short range zone, but I have engaged by moving that distance in between me and the target.
Yep. And the interesting thing there is if you're using a house as an example, you could be in different rooms within that house, still within short range. You can't shoot at each other because there's walls between you.
And that's where the GM fiat comes in. Because GM goes, this zone is one house. If you want to get within line of sight of someone, you're always going to have to spend a maneuver to do so.
To do so, yeah. Absolutely.
And you can add difficulties to traverse zones.
Difficult terrain works wonders all of a sudden because you have to spend 2 maneuvers to move around within the one zone. And traversing multiple zones becomes much slower and much more difficult. Now, this is what the thing I love about zones the most is you can introduce roadblocks, more or less.
Challenges
to get from one zone to another. And that could be anything. So I'm
like a locked door?
A locked door, that's right. I'm in my house. I want to get into that house. The GM says, okay, to move from the front yard zone into the house zone, you're going to have to pass a mechanics check to pick the lock. If you failed, you take your action. You fail, you don't get into the house.
And you could represent that on the table by putting down the difficulty or something.
Exactly.
But you as a player might get creative and say, look, I want to kick the door in.
And GM goes, okay, this roadblock's now actually going to be a athletics check or a brawn check or whatever you want to call it. So much you can do with it. Sneaking past a patrol of guards is another one. It may necessarily stop you from getting into that new zone. The GM will say, okay, if you want to get to zone A to zone B without being detected, you're going to have to make a successful stealth check.
Yep.
Which the best thing, and this is why I call this system elegant, is that this is already just the rules.
It is 100% the rules.
This is just what we're doing already.
Neatened up and tidied up and made a lot more visually.
That's it. It's visual.
Visual and visceral because the players can interact with everything. Now, how do you interact with this? Like on the table, you do it one of two ways. You can either, the GM can just create a simple flowchart with connectors going to each bubble, and each bubble's a zone.
You can do it on a piece of paper.
Yep. Exactly. Or you get fancy like we have when we've got some actually some clear hexes that we use, and each hex is a zone.
And then we draw on the hexes.
That's right. And where the hexes touch is a narrative representation of where one zone will lead into another.
Yep.
For example, the front yard zone would be connected to the house zone.
Yep.
And so the player knows at a glance that to get from this zone to that zone, they're going to have to be connecting.
Yep.
And the connection point between zones isn't necessarily a straight walk. The connection between two zones could be kilometers if you wanted to get silly with it. There's no reason why one zone couldn't be, one side of the city and the other relevant zone is the other side of the city. But there's going to be some GM fiat as to how you get there.
Yep.
Obviously, and that's a wild example. But in a more realistic example, going from one zone to another zone could be a case of describing as going up a set of stairs.
Yep.
Simple
Spend
as
that maneuver. Walk up the stairs.
A really good way of looking at it for people who do have the book is to look at Android Shadow of the Beanstalk. When you are looking at your zones when you're looking at net running and the flow chart that they have can sort of be, that's kind of what we're talking about in a roundabout sort of
you can do a flowchart just like that, which is one of the good things about this system is because you can just put down, you don't need hexes, you don't need anything fancy, you don't need a big drawing, that is one for one the area that you're in. It can just be a piece of paper and a pencil and you draw down a flowchart.
You've seen my hotel one that I've done.
Yeah, it's great.
It's my hotel one. I've not listed any visual details of this hotel. I've just written in this particular circle, lobby. This particular circle, reception. This particular circle, IT department.
One of the other things that I love about this is that there can be blank zones. And as you say, as a player, you roll a perception check to sort of look about and figure things out. Maybe you roll a triumph or just you notice something special. The storyteller could fill it in, or you, with the triumph, could say that is a supply closet, or that's the armory. You can fill out what's in this zone.
Oh, that's a secret door that lets me take from this zone to this other zone that wasn't previously there. It's a hidden department.
Once again, it's something you can already do in the system. This is just a visual representation of how you do it.
Yep.
So the only rewrite really that you have to do to the rules is when we're talking about movement and maneuvers. So basically, it takes you a maneuver to if there was nothing in the way,
no environmental effects
or anything like that. It would be one maneuver to move one zone.
Correct.
Yes.
So, and also keep in mind that zones stretch out between multiple range bands. So two zones for a range band, basically.
Unless you're talking short.
It's always
a single zone.
The one you're in.
And that's the reason why hexes work the best that we've found. Because you can use anything you want, really.
Yeah,
we've sort of, I've obviously gone and got a hex sort of grid mapped out where it's got one hex in the middle and it's got all the hexes around that would be connected to that hex.
Yeah.
But you didn't have to be that way.
You don't have to, not at all.
And there's no facing. Because it's a narrative zone, you're looking wherever you need to.
That's right.
Narrative. You don't need a model on the table.
It's sort of like a storyboard.
It is a storyboard.
Yeah,
storyboard more than anything else. Each bubble is a new narrative section. And just because it happens to be sitting next to say you're using hexes, and I have my house zone in the middle, and there's a zone to its right. That zone doesn't necessarily have to be in the real world to the house's right. That could be a basement zone. In the real world, that zone's actually below the house.
Yeah.
So the placement where it physically sits as the visual aid is no actual representation of where it sits in the real world.
One of with the 2D20 system for Modifius, one of the things that they have with zones as well as environments is obviously they have traits, which effectively can be, if you have, like we use the example that you just used then, Mike, is that you would have one of those hexes, or one of those zones is the basement, and it's connected to the main part of the house. You might have that it has the underground trait, and the GM basically says, and this is what that means.
Yep.
And so that's a consistent thing that until that changes for whatever reason, let's say, for example, that suddenly the house blows up, or you cast some sort of, I don't know, portal or whatever else that suddenly creates a massive hole in the floor. Well, then maybe those two zones suddenly become combined.
Yeah, one zone. Also, it's also to keep, you mentioned that, and it sort of brings something to my mind as well, line of sight.
Yep.
Seeing into other zones isn't necessarily a straightforward, straight line of sight.
Yep.
Basement's a perfect example. Yes, there's going to be a floor on the way. So the GM says, well, that basement is underground. Until you get yourself in a position where you can see down a trap hole, trap door, or something like that, you cannot draw a line of sight to that basement below.
Yep.
Once again, this is exactly the same as the normal rules.
That's
Exactly the same as the normal rules.
right.
So it's important for the GM to manage zones like that. And most of the time, the players just need to ask, and the GM will just answer. And most of the time, it's common sense. If one zone is a hotel lobby, and another zone is a building across the street, chances are the rooftop from the building across the street won't be able to see into the hotel lobby.
You can see the opposing rooftop.
Could see the opposing rooftop. Or if the player had a high-powered scope that could see through walls, different story. The GM could say, well, normally you couldn't see into that lobby, but you do have that scope, and you can see the thermal imaging of the target through the walls. Yeah. So yes, you can see into that
And
zone.
they've got heavy cover because of that.
Heavy cover there. So there's lots you can do of zones, and I have written all these up, but we have been hesitant to release that into the world because we don't want people thinking we're making GeneSys a map grid game.
No.
Because if you glance at it, that's what it looks like.
But it really isn't.
It's not. It is. You don't always need to do that.
No. Most combats you don't.
Don't.
It's when you get big.
With lots of moving parts, lots of features and rooms and people, very useful.
Speaking of big, and now I don't want to touch on vehicles, but there is an additional range band that vehicles introduce.
That is true.
Which is strategic. And in this system, if you want to use it, it is 2 zones beyond extreme.
Yep.
Takes you into strategic.
Yep.
Everything beyond that is strategic.
Yep.
Yeah, most of the time, you don't necessarily have to worry about it.
You don't know.
Rarely come up.
I just mention
but
it in case people want to include it.
Yeah.
But you could also, as a GM, stretch extreme range out to as far as you narratively like. Yeah.
But that's it. And this is why I say if you want to include strategic, it just breaks down like the rest.
Yep. Absolutely.
But zones are the bomb.
They are.
Yeah.
And
They've certainly made our games much easier.
Absolutely.
It speeds play.
Does speed up play. If you want to get the general inspiration from this, look up one of the 2D20 games.
Yep.
Well, Star Trek Adventures definitely uses zones. I know Infinity uses zones. I can only assume the other 2D20 systems use zones as well.
Yeah.
But look into them, and you'll see the inspiration that has fueled our concept behind GeneSys zones.
Because, I mean, ultimately, as Martin has mentioned, the rules have been there the whole time. They aren't just necessarily...
This is just giving a visual representation.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that you have to do when you use these rules is your relative positioning. You can basically put a big line through it.
Yeah, just toss it in the bin.
That's
because you don't have to, no one has to remember where you are to anything, because you can just look at the visual representation and it tells you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And things happening within a zone and things beyond zones, or purely narrative with whatever limitations or whatever the GM wants to establish.
Yep.
You can't see into that other zone because of XYZ reason. There's a wall there, smoke, whatever.
Yeah.
It's the GM has clear control of the environment. There's no ambiguity between players of where they can be seen or what can be done, etc. And also, it allows a GM to say, hey, you're standing, this particular zone is a hotel lobby. It's a pill-shaped room with a vaulted ceiling with 6 pillars running along either side, filled with fancy lounges and etc. That's a very vague, quick description of that one zone, but immediately the players know what that zone looks like. They know when they go into the zone, that's what it looks like, and they know that's the sandbox they have to play in, and they can interact with that. I dive behind that pillar and fire my shotgun at the guy on the opposing pillar.
Now, if you're a GM who does a lot of game prep, that you might print out a small card with a picture that you found on the internet of how you visualize that room. Yeah. You can basically put that on the table and that's a zone.
I love this as well as an idea because you could write down a bunch of different zones on a deck of cards and then you can arrange them on the table as you need.
Exactly.
And just put lines between which ones connect to which ones. It's really easy. And that is a way that you can randomly generate a building or something.
And there's heaps of resources which are out there, which is very similar to that. Chase cards from Pathfinder. They've got 2 different deck types.
Yep.
You can make your own.
Yeah.
You know, there's nothing to say that you can't. You can
just
put
get a
some
regular
additional
deck of cards and paste some.
Put some additional rules in there for what happens, what sort of traits that this particular
filled with smoke.
Or something like that.
Because you don't need fancy artwork. You literally just have blank cards with names on it.
I encourage not putting artwork.
I agree. Because as soon as you do artwork, people go, this is what it is.
This is what it looks like.
Yep,
you can add whatever details you want. Remember, you spend an advantage, you notice something in the environment. You spend a triumph, you can change that environment in some way.
Well, like the hotel lobby. I haven't mentioned a chandelier or lack of chandelier. Our player just goes, well, I noticed that chandelier hanging from the ceiling.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden there's a chandelier there.
You spend a story point.
Yeah, whatever. They've got some advantages. They notice a story point. However the players want to interject that narrative. And the GM can also add extra details to the rooms as the encounters unfold.
Threats and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well,
Don't forget what the storyteller can do.
It's a shame you didn't notice the sentry turrets in that hotel lobby room.
Right.
Or that blank room was actually a security room, and everyone in there is about to flood out into your fight because you've been making a lot of
Or it's
noise.
some sort of kill zone. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. So, Theo, hopefully that answered the question. So the second question tonight comes from Dave Smith, also via the Facebooks. Where Dave writes, I am not certain if this is the right kind of question to ask on the show, but I would be interested to hear ideas on making combat more tactical. I know the dice system is narrative by its nature, but I am curious if there are methods or ideas explored by others that might lend a tactical feel to combat while allowing for the narrative, social, and dramatic encounters. Go back and listen to exactly what we just said in the last question. However,
Goes a long way to helping that tactical feel.
absolutely. However, if you are a GM, and I know that Chris West, who's a fan of the podcast, who does up these absolutely spectacular maps. If you haven't looked at it, do a Google search on Christopher West, Games Mastery. I think it's that's the name of his company, and he does some amazing work. I think I've got all of his maps. But if you are the sort of GM who does use maps in your games, basically just get out, if you've got them laminated or whatever else, and I would highly recommend doing that, that you just get out your overhead pen and you just mark out on that map zones.
Yep.
Yeah, it's no way
And
to
that
do it.
is the easiest way to go, right, to go from this to this, it's going to be a zone move.
And something else that we have discussed previously, I think Chase ran it in his game. So I think it was our last recording.
Yep.
Is the idea of when the planning phase happened, do it as a skill challenge. Advantages, threats, successes can be used by the players to sort of generate things in the environment that are positive to them.
Yeah.
Setbacks, threats, failures can be used to generate negative aspects in the environment by the storyteller.
Absolutely.
And that way it's that it's the team sitting in the room, putting together the heist.
Yeah.
Yep. And also, if Dave Smith wants to bring more tactical elements to the game, I'm not sure how tactical he wants to get.
Yep.
But you introduce things like making just combat more lethal. Because nothing makes something more tactical is by making it more lethal. If
And you have to be more precise.
Exactly. If players go, well, if I get hit, there's a good chance I will die or get incapacitated, then it suddenly becomes a lot more tactical.
Yep.
Secondly, Dave could also look at the mass combat stuff in Star Wars.
Yes.
Although it's not going to work in a one-for-one in a regular personal scale combat, there's a lot of advantages in threat expenditure, which could be used for inspiration and ported into a more tactical personal scale combat.
Yeah.
Especially if you do a pre-planning prep or something like that, then you could introduce all sorts of other cool features.
Yeah.
Look at play some video games like Rainbow Six, Siege, Battlefield, all those sort of games. Watch how combat unfolds in those games and try and see what elements of that you can bring into GeneSys RPG.
Yep.
And pay attention to the environment.
Yep.
Because nothing makes things more tactical when, positioning becomes relevant. That sort of stuff becomes really good.
Yep.
And if you want to get very, very tactile and precise, there's no reason why you couldn't just assign, this is stepping away from the zone concept, but there's no reason why you couldn't assign movement in a more traditional way.
Like 6 squares is a maneuver.
Exactly.
Yeah, do it however you want.
There's lots you can get. There's lots you can do with this rule system, which keep the fundamentals the same by tweaking the small things here and there.
Yep.
Yep. And ultimately, it's your game, and as long as everybody's playing under the same rules, it should be balanced.
And you're consistent.
Yes,
Consistency is key.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Play the game how you enjoy it.
Yep.
Absolutely. So hopefully, Dave, that has answered your question as well. And for our final question, Martin.
So for our final question from Mike Eric
Bybighauser?
Bybighauser via Facebook, he's asked, unrelated to the upcoming topic,
Which is combat.
can you offer any tips or advice for running the game via Discord or Skype or etc.? It feels twice as hard to run GeneSys narratively this way as opposed to other tabletops without any body language and shared table buy-in.
It is the big question when it comes to doing stuff online.
Yep. I know me personally, when I run or play a game on Discord, I struggle for the same reason, body language.
Yeah.
And in GeneSys, I feel it is a very big thing because you sort of feed off one another in this game because you roll a narrative dice and someone give you ideas and bounce things back and forwards. And as soon as you're on Discord, it becomes hard to have a discussion about talking over someone because that's just the way online communication is. It's tough. You can't read when someone wants to talk and et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
It is very, very tricky. And I think there's never going to be a, yes, this solves all the problems answer to this question.
But there are dice roller apps that you can get to use in the actual chat, which helps with this.
Yep, absolutely.
You can keep it in a separate
chat
room to have a log of the results so that that helps with the table buy-in because everything's out in the open and everyone can see it.
The other thing as well is that there are other third-party places that you can use in conjunction with Discord.
Absolutely.
So you can have Discord running in the background, but everybody's jumped on, Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds or whatever else. And all of those have their own
virtual tables. You've also got
Tabletop Simulator is another good one because you have a shared 3D table.
True.
Which I think is pretty underutilized at the moment, to be honest. Sorry, guys.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sam.
So there's also, they've all got dice roller apps that can basically be thrown into them. They are third party and they've, sometimes they're glitchy, sometimes they're not. But Roll20 I've had a little bit of experience on and it's very, very successful. I know that a lot of gamers still use Fantasy Grounds and when you're doing things like zones, you can, as long as you've got the ability to be able to draw something, that's
you can throw up that flowchart.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can chuck that anywhere. You chuck that in any of those online D20 role play managers.
Take a photo, just chuck it up in the Discord.
In Discord, yeah, absolutely. That's another option as well.
I think one of the big hurdles of Discord is that lack of face to face.
Yeah.
And what can help fix that is cameras.
Yep.
Discord has a really, really good live feed video system now.
Yep.
Better than Skype, but that's not hard to do. Pretty sure Stone Tablet's better than Skype these days, but that's neither here or there. It does a really, really good solid video feeds.
Yep.
And if you can get everyone playing to have a web camera set up and you can look at one another, it doesn't fix the problem, but you can still see one another, and it does help that player buy in.
Because you're bringing back body language,
Yeah,
you're bringing
exactly.
back, engagement with the person speaking.
Now, there is one thing that is very difficult to overcome, and that is distraction. When you're sitting in a room by yourself on a Discord game, it's super easy to get distracted. They could be looking at Facebook. They could be just doing whatever in the room, not even necessarily on the computer or your phone. Because you are by yourself, you're isolated. You don't have that human contact. So trying to find ways around that to keep people focused on the game will go a long way, and that will vary from group to group. One thing you could do, and it's a little thing, is have a shared music system. If you can get music playing in your game on a shared Discord music bot, that goes a long way because it brings everyone, it gives that sort of connective tissue between everyone. Because everyone's listening to that same music and being tied to the same theme.
And it fills the gaps.
It does fill the gaps. There's never an awkward silence because that music is always there. Because that's the killer for me, to be honest, in Discord games, is the silence. Because everyone's waiting for someone to talk. And as a GM, it's so hard to read what your players are doing. And as a GM, it's one of those unwritten things about GMing. You body language. As a GM, you use body language all the time. You don't know it until it's not there.
Yeah.
I think that there's always that's going to be something which is always going to be there because you're not physically in the room. And I think that there has to be a certain buy-in with the players as well. So that expectation has to be set from the start to say, okay, these are the additional rules that we'll be using. So, if you're, for whatever reason, real life does happen, that suddenly, your partner comes in or the kids come in or whatever else, please use your mute button so that we're not hearing the ensuing discussion with your 3-year-old about body training or whatever. So, there needs to be just a set of rules that you have to put into play that everybody has that buy-in, goes back to, session 0. And I know that we go back to that a lot, but there needs to be that expectation set on what is going to be expected of the players at the table, and the same thing for the GM.
Yeah, it is one of the most important things in any role-playing game.
Yep. That's right.
So in summary to his question, try and bridge all the gaps of distance as possible. Cameras, music, player buy-in, so you're all at the same level and knowledge of like how you anticipate the game going to go. So there's no ambiguity if what's accepted, not accepted. Everyone understands that. But yeah, it's tough, but it isn't impossible.
Something you could do, I don't know how possible it is, but if some of your players can be in the same room,
like it's help.
Encourage it.
Well, I know when we do that, Dark Heresy, Caitlin and Chase are in the same room. So that helps them bounce off one another a fair bit. There's no reason why you and I couldn't get together or whatever and try and do it. It is difficult because we are
a little bit away from each
distance
other.
apart, so it is tricky.
But if you can, where you can, get some of your players into the same room.
It helps.
Exactly. Right. Well, Eric, hopefully Mike, hopefully that does answer the question.
Alleviate his woes somewhat.
Yes. And there's a few things, and I'm sure that that's probably a show topic within itself as well on how to do that.
That would be a good show topic to get someone who does a lot, because we don't do Discord games a whole lot. No. So if but I do know there is GMs and groups out there who do it exclusively due to their circumstances. So if we can get someone on board who is an expert at it, they could shed some light for us and listeners.
Absolutely.
So I'd be keen to know how to make it better.
Absolutely. All right, so that pretty much brings us to the end of another really cool episode where we've talked about combat. So hopefully, if you do have any other burning questions about combat, you can always send us an email, which is info@thedicepoolpodcast.com, or if you've just got generally comments, queries, questions about the Dice Pool Podcast, please let us know. You can also send those questions to us via Facebook and Twitter. And of course, if you are lucky, we may even read your questions out on the show.
You can also visit us on our website at www.thedicepoolpodcast.com.
Also, make sure to like and follow us on all of our social media accounts, such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, by searching at Dicepool Podcast. And of course, you can also message us and many more of our fellow D20 Radio Network podcasters via Discord on the D20 Radio channel. Now, finally, you can also find us on iTunes and your favourite podcatcher. Of course, if you are feeling generous, please take some time to post or send us a review, as it really helps us bump up the queue and gets the show the exposure we think it deserves. And additionally, you can also send us a review on Facebook as well. So, yeah, pretty much thanks very much for everybody listening in to us, banter on about GeneSys and all things gaming.
However,
yes,
we haven't mentioned the elephant in the room yet.
Oh,
There's
what
an
is the
elephant.
Us Australians still have not got our Shadow of the Beanstalk book.
That is true.
Thanks for reminding me.
Wow.
So I am,
Chewing at the bit.
well, I see people online go, oh, I've got it. I'm like, ew. That's okay, because I still have the test playbook at home. So
That is true.
I soothe myself with that every night. It's not the same.
No. It is.
But
Yes. So that was something that we can now talk about, briefly about the playtest that we were involved in for the book, and we gave a lot of feedback for that. And I know that
You'll
they've
see our
taken
name
some
in
of
the front.
You will. It's very exciting.
yeah, the net running section is what we provide a lot of feedback on.
Yeah, and
And-
it's come along really, really well from
Yeah.
all the reports that are coming in. They all think it's really, really cool. I know that somebody mentioned that it's basically GeneSys, the dice game. I don't necessarily agree with that, but
What?
that's what somebody said that it was.
Yeah,
I'm confused.
I can't
What?
agree with that.
GeneSys, the dice. Well, yeah, it's dice in it.
Yes, but there's a lot of dice rolling that goes on. I don't necessarily agree with that, but
If you're not, okay. I've gone whole sessions of like maybe rolling 4 checks.
yes,
I guess that's how narrative you get with the game.
Yeah.
But that's neither here or there. What I was thinking about for Android when it drops, once I get my book,
Yes.
I was thinking maybe, time permitting, doing up a GM Huzz's net running tips guide.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
Because I was reading a little bit, someone did a quick review
Yep.
for Shadow of the Beanstalk,
Yeah.
and they mentioned that the net running looks great, but it looks overwhelming. It's really not. If you're
It
listening,
isn't.
if you're listening this far, it is complex in terms of there's lots of information there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the actual fundamental mechanics is quite straightforward. You have to just read the rules. Every player who will be running needs to read the rules
Yep.
and be quite knowledgeable on them.
Yep.
And pre-planned runs with some blank networks.
Yep.
So when you're at the ready, you can just go as a GM. This is your run, and this is the ice that you're going to be running
And
into.
don't be afraid to reuse a network. Just have
Exactly.
some different challenges.
Absolutely.
Well, during the playtest, we discussed it'd be cool to do up a heap of just blank networks with pre-built networks.
Yeah.
Just release them as a PDF, and the GM can just whip one out when he needs to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It'd be very, very cool.
But we'll have some more chatting about this.
Yes, we will.
I'd rather talk about it now, though.
Unfortunately, we don't have Sam, and
Or
that's
books.
Or books. I'm hoping that at least Drive-Through RPG will come to the rescue next week. Hopefully,
Sam?
maybe Sam. But yes, Sam Stewart has agreed to join us on the podcast to talk about everything.
We get to
GeneSys.
we
Which will
get
be
we,
very, very
we
cool.
get his soothing tones on our podcast again.
We will.
Yeah.
He's
He's
very
blessed with a voice, that man. I was watching him on YouTube the other day. I'm like, how's he not like doing something with that voice and like voice acting or something like that? It's,
He's a busy
It's very
man.
cool. He is. But the interesting thing for those who do have access to the book, and that's not us Australians, that's about the third time I've mentioned it now, or at least one of us has, is that that you've obviously got the Shadow of the Beanstalk, the rule book. You've then also got the adversary cards, and there are 3 packs of adversary cards, and they look super cool. But the other thing as well, which I was quite surprised about, is the novella, which is called Undercity, which has been released at the same time, which is available via Drive-Thru RPG, actually has Android content, which is really cool as well. Yes, it does. So I was
going to buy it anyway. So,
but yeah. So if you are looking for additional Android content, definitely take a look. Looking at it before as well, the character sheets are also available on the FFG website as well. So take a look at that as well. Yes, I think I've said as well too many times there, but that's okay.
Well, I'm GM Huzz.
I'm GM Hooly.
And I'm GM Flano.
And together we are the Dice Pool Podcast, where adventure is just a roll away. The Dice Pool Podcast is a proud member of the D20 Radio Network. For more information about the network, visit www.d20radio.com. The Dice Pool Podcast is a fan-generated podcast. All of the information provided on the podcast and related website are not affiliated with Fantasy Flight Games or any of their licensors. The content of this podcast remains the property of the Dice Pool Podcast and is intended for educational and informational purposes only. The GeneSys role-playing game, the GeneSys logo, content, and all material remain the property of Fantasy Flight Games.